Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, but today it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. Whispers from the Void. My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me, and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest, and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right. Her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now, like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. You're not supposed to leave. I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. It was supposed to be just an ordinary day at home. The house sat on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by open fields and woods that stretched for miles in every direction. I lived alone, but I wasn't one to feel uneasy about the quiet, isolated life. At least, I wasn't until that day. The morning started off normal, just another day of cleaning, catching up on emails, and preparing for the usual chores. But something about the air felt off. It wasn't heavy or oppressive, just different. I shook it off, attributing it to the weather. Maybe the storm they'd predicted was finally rolling in. Around noon, the rain began, soft at first, but growing stronger by the hour. I watched it from the kitchen window, sipping my coffee. The sky was a thick, dull gray, and everything beyond the yard blurred under the falling sheets. I didn't think much of it until I heard the knock. It came softly at first, 3 quick raps on the front door. I froze, my coffee halfway to my lips. The knocking came again, a bit louder this time, persistent. But no one ever showed themselves. I told myself it was probably just someone needing shelter from the storm. Maybe a neighbor, though no one I recognized. I stood in front of the door, heart hammering, and cracked it open just a little. No one was there. I peered outside into the rain, but the porch was empty. There was no one around, just the relentless downpour and the empty, soaking fields beyond. I checked the locks and decided to ignore it. Must have been my imagination, I told myself. Storms can mess with your head. I went back to the living room, the chill of the rain beginning to seep into my bones. The windows fogged up as the rain continued to fall harder. The noise outside grew louder, the steady pitter-patter of droplets becoming a relentless pounding. It was soothing in a way, like the world was washing away everything around me. Hours passed. I lost track of time, engrossed in some half-read book, when a sudden noise made my blood run cold. A slow, scraping sound came from the back of the house, faint but deliberate, like something dragging across the floor. My stomach clenched and I sat there, frozen, waiting. The scraping grew louder. It wasn't coming from the window or the door, but from deeper inside the house. The kind of sound that made you wonder how something could even move like that. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, maybe some loose shutter flapping against the wall, but the wind doesn't scrape like that. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. Each step felt heavier, each breath quieter. The scraping continued, rhythmic, unnerving. I reached the hallway leading to the back of the house and shined my light down the dark corridor. That's when I saw it. A figure hunched over and shuffling, moving towards the kitchen. Its back was grotesquely twisted and its arms were far too long, dragging along the floor. I couldn't make out a face, just dark voids where eyes should have been, and something glistening at the corners of its mouth. Panic surged through me, but I didn't scream. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, frozen in place as the thing advanced. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low, raspy breathing that seemed to echo through the house. Then it stopped. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, I could feel its presence just a few feet away, as if it had paused, waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing through the quiet. Who's there? I managed to whisper, but my voice barely escaped. Silence. Another long minute passed, the air thick with dread. I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own breathing and the relentless rain outside. Slowly, cautiously, I backed away, retracing my steps. The figure never followed. I didn't hear it leave. But when I checked the back door, the lock was undone. I didn't sleep that night, clutching my phone tightly, waiting for dawn. The storm raged on, but whatever had been there, watching, had never come back. I don't remember how I ended up on the hiking trail that day. I'd never been much of an outdoors person, but something about the open air and quiet drew me there. My plan had been simple: spend the afternoon walking along a familiar trail, clear my head, and get away from everything for a while. It wasn't a popular trail, tucked deep into the mountains where few people dared to venture. I'd come across it a few times before, but never explored it fully. The sun was high, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The air was crisp, the kind of silence that wraps around you and feels endless. I walked for hours, following the winding trail deeper into the woods, never thinking twice about turning back. It felt peaceful. Too peaceful. The absence of birds, the quiet rustling of leaves. The trail was so isolated I almost expected to hear nothing at all. But still, something nagged at the back of my mind. It was as if the woods themselves were watching. Eventually, I found myself standing at a fork in the path. One side led to a steep incline, the other seemed to stretch on toward the valley below. Without hesitation, I chose the incline, curious about where it might lead. It wasn't until I'd climbed what felt like hours that I realized I was well beyond any familiar landmarks. I told myself to turn back, but something kept me going. The air became colder as I ascended, the trees growing denser. The trail became narrower, and I started to notice strange markings on the bark of the trees. Scratches, like someone had carved symbols into the wood. I brushed them off as some random hiker's curiosity, but there was a pattern, one I couldn't quite place. The farther I went, the quieter it became, until even my own footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally. That's when I heard it. A faint, hollow whisper, like the wind carrying someone else's voice. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no wind, no breeze. The air was still. "Help me," the voice said, barely audible. It was distant, but clear. I stood there, my skin crawling as I listened. My heart raced, but I couldn't move. "Help me," the voice repeated, louder this time. It wasn't coming from any particular direction. It was all around me. Panic surged through my chest and I turned to run, only to trip over something in the undergrowth. My flashlight bounced away, leaving me in darkness. The woods felt alive, shifting around me as though they were watching, waiting. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed my phone, only to find there was no signal. The darkness felt heavier now, oppressive, like the trees were closing in. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to steady myself. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Just silence, except for that whisper growing closer now, louder, echoing in my ears. "Help me." I turned, panic turning my vision blurry as I saw a figure, tall, gaunt, and pale, standing at the edge of the trail. Its features were obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its hollow gaze fixated on me. I backed away, my hands shaking, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was begging. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run before, dodging branches and tripping over rocks. The whisper followed me, always just a step behind. The path seemed endless, the trees shifting and bending as if to block my way. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into an open clearing. The sky above me was dark, stars faintly visible through a break in the trees. My chest heaved as I collapsed to the ground, trembling. The whisper had stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The woods were still, too still. I wanted to stay there, but I couldn't. I forced myself to my feet and followed the path I had come from. I kept walking until I saw the faint outline of the trailhead. As I stepped out into the open, the first light of dawn touched the horizon. I could still feel it, though. The heavy weight of the woods, like something was watching, waiting, still following me. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. It was a calm afternoon, the kind where the heat seems to bend the air. My friends and I decided to take a trip to the local beach. a place we'd visited many times before, but something felt different this time. The sun glared down from a cloudless sky as we pulled into the empty parking lot. The beach wasn't far, just a short walk from the car, but there were fewer people than usual. We set up our towels and chairs, laughing as we dove into the cool water. The waves were gentle, the kind you don't think twice about. For a while, it felt like nothing could go wrong. We swam, played around, and enjoyed the simplicity of the day. It wasn't until later, when the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the shore, that things began to feel off. We were sitting on the sand, watching the horizon, when one of my friends suddenly pointed toward the water. "There's something out there," she said, her voice quieter than before. At first, I didn't see anything, just the vast expanse of blue stretching out to meet the sky. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a figure far in the distance. It wasn't a person, not a swimmer or a surfer. It looked almost like a shadow, dark and indistinct, moving slowly beneath the surface. The water didn't ripple in the way waves normally do. It was as if something was swimming just beneath, something large, something unnatural. "Is it a shark?" one of my friends asked, but none of us could answer. We all stood there staring at the spot where the figure had been, but now it was gone. The beach had become unnervingly quiet, save for the faint lapping of the waves. The sun had all but disappeared, replaced by a faint orange glow on the horizon. It was beautiful in an eerie way, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was off. "We should go," someone said. The idea of walking back to the car felt like a relief, but we couldn't shake the unease. The path back to the parking lot was dark and desolate, lined with dunes on one side and endless ocean on the other. The air felt thick, heavier than before, and we walked in silence. Halfway back, we stopped. There was a sound, something faint but unmistakable. A splash, not far from the shore. It echoed in the quiet evening air. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything else, but it was as if the world had gone still. No wind, no birds, just the faint sound of the waves. Then came the whispering. It started softly at first, almost like the wind, but we realized there wasn't any wind. It was a voice, or rather, many voices, whispers carried on the breeze. They were faint and incomprehensible, as if they were speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Panic gripped me. I could feel it in the way my heart pounded in my chest. We weren't alone. Something was out there, watching us, waiting. "We need to get back now," one of my friends said, her voice trembling. As we hurried to the car, the whispers grew louder, surrounding us. It was as though the entire beach was alive, breathing, and the sound of those whispers seemed to come from everywhere. I kept turning, scanning the dunes and the water, but saw nothing. Yet the voices remained, growing more insistent, more sinister. We finally made it to the car, fumbling with the keys, heartbeats thudding in our ears. The moment we slammed the doors shut, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Driving away, we didn't speak much. All I could think about was that figure beneath the water, the whispers that seemed to follow us, and how wrong the beach had felt. When I glanced back, the beach was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Whatever we saw that day, it's still out there, waiting. I remember the night clearly, even though I wish I didn't. It wasn't like a typical horror story where something obvious happens and you can't look away. No, this was different. A quiet, unsettling terror that crept in slowly, unnoticed, until it was already too late. It started with an evening trip. A group of us decided to go for a hike up an old, abandoned mountain trail that no one in town really talked about anymore. The path was barely visible through the trees, and we figured it'd be fun to explore something that felt off the map. No one else had been there in years, from what we'd heard. The trail wasn't difficult at first, just some rocky terrain and patches of overgrown bushes. But as we kept walking deeper into the forest, something felt off. The air seemed thick, heavier. The usual sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves were replaced by a strange, oppressive silence. Even the forest itself felt strange, like it was watching us. We had been hiking for what felt like hours when we came across a clearing, a wide space surrounded by towering pines. There was an old, crumbling structure at the center of the clearing. It looked like a small, forgotten cabin, its roof partially caved in, and the walls worn with age. None of us had expected to find something like this out here. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. "We should check it out," one of my friends, Mark, said, stepping toward the cabin. The others hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. The closer we got, the more uneasy I became. The silence seemed to thicken, as though the forest itself had swallowed all sound. The door of the cabin creaked open under our weight, revealing a room filled with dust-covered furniture and remnants of something long forgotten. We stepped inside, hesitant, but everything seemed still. There was nothing alive inside except for us. As we poked around, one of my friends, Laura, pointed out something strange. The walls were covered in old, faded drawings. Children's drawings, but they weren't the usual cheerful, innocent sketches. These were distorted, eerie, figures with hollow eyes, twisted shapes, and scribbled faces that seemed to stare at us from the faded paper. "That's creepy," Mark said, turning pale. We quickly decided to leave, but as we stepped outside, the feeling of unease only deepened. It wasn't just the creepy drawings or the old decaying cabin. It was something else. A presence. It wasn't threatening, but there was an undeniable sense that we weren't supposed to be there. We moved quickly through the woods, trying to shake the sense of discomfort that had settled over us. The trail became steeper, harder to follow as we pressed on, and the oppressive silence grew even thicker. Then, as we were about to turn back, we heard it, the soft sound of footsteps behind us. But there was no one there. "Guys, stop," I whispered, turning around. The others froze. "I hear it too," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, like someone, or something, was walking just beyond the tree line, following us. We hurried, but the sound seemed to be growing closer, as though whatever was following us was keeping pace. No matter how far we went, the noise remained, distant but persistent. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we finally reached the trailhead, we stopped, breathing heavily. The trees loomed around us, shadows stretching long in the fading light. That's when I realized something was missing. One of my friends, Emma, was gone. "Where's Emma?" I asked, my voice trembling. The others looked at each other, panic setting in. We split up, calling her name, but the only response was silence. The woods had swallowed her, leaving us alone once again. We couldn't find Emma. We never did. She was just gone. There was no trace of her, no sign of where she might have gone. The forest had taken her, and we were too afraid to go back in and search again. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that something was in those woods, something that watched us, followed us, and took Emma. And whatever it was, I'm convinced it's still out there, waiting. I remember the day clearly. It wasn't anything special, just a regular evening in an old, crumbling city. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world had paused. I was walking home from the library after a long day of studying. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the cracked pavement. It was late, maybe 11 p.m., and I decided to take a shortcut through an alley. The air was thick with a strange metallic smell, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept walking, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger. I reached the mouth of the alley when I heard a soft, uneven scraping sound behind me. I froze. My breath caught, and I turned slowly, expecting to see someone, maybe a homeless person or a cat. But there was nothing. The alley stretched behind me, empty and dark. My heart pounded as I took a cautious step backward, keeping my eyes on the shadows. I scanned the space again, hoping to find some rational explanation for the noise. There was nothing. I continued walking, but the unease lingered. The scraping sound echoed in my mind, growing louder with every step. I glanced back one last time and saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the alley, obscured by the dim light. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but I felt its presence in my bones. My legs felt frozen, like I couldn't move. The figure remained still, watching, as though it was waiting for me. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw another shadow, just to my left. This one was closer, much closer. I could feel its cold breath on my neck as I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Panic set in. I started running, my footsteps echoing through the alley, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every turn I took, there was always something watching, always a presence just out of reach. Eventually, I found myself at the end of the alley, my chest heaving, breath coming in ragged gasps. The streets stretched out before me, quiet as ever. I didn't know how long I'd been running, but the silence was worse than the fear. It wasn't until I turned to leave the alley that I saw them again. 3 figures, standing perfectly still, watching me from across the street. Their faces were hidden, shadows consuming them, but I could feel their gaze as if they were right beside me. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. I forced myself to look away and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I was safe inside my apartment. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling. The silence of the night was broken only by my own trembling breath. I don't know what those figures were, or what they wanted. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of fear before, and I hope I never feel it again. It was a late summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old lighthouse on the edge of the coast. We had heard the stories about the place. The locals always mentioned strange things happening out there, but none of us believed in the so-called haunted lighthouse tales. We were just looking for an adventurous night, something to break the monotony of our usual weekends. The lighthouse stood on a narrow stretch of rocky coastline, rising above the crashing waves. The air was thick with salt, and the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly, the sun dipping into the dark sea. We parked the car a few hundred feet from the lighthouse and started walking the narrow gravel path that led up to it. The wind was fierce, tearing at our jackets, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below echoed like a low, persistent hum. It was eerie, but we all just laughed it off, attributing it to the remoteness of the place. When we reached the base of the lighthouse, the first thing I noticed was how worn down it looked. The old white paint was peeling, revealing patches of weathered stone beneath. It felt abandoned, yet oddly familiar. We climbed the spiral staircase inside, the sound of our footsteps clattering against the cold metal steps. At the top, the view was stunning. The sun had fully set by now, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple, the stars beginning to emerge. We stood there, leaning against the railing, mesmerized by the vastness of the ocean stretching out before us. But that's when I noticed something unusual. It wasn't just the beauty of the view, it was the silence. No seagulls, no distant boats, no wind. It was as though the world had stopped. Did anyone else hear that? I asked, breaking the quiet. They all turned, confused. Hear what? Someone replied. I don't know. It's too quiet. It's unnatural. As the minutes dragged on, we stood there staring out at the horizon. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing on the edge of the cliff. My breath hitched. Is that someone out there? I whispered, pointing. None of them saw it. The figure was silhouetted against the dark sea, motionless, as if waiting. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but it didn't move. And then, just as suddenly as I'd seen it, the figure was gone. I glanced at my friends, but they were still oblivious, staring out at the sea. "Maybe it's just my eyes playing tricks," I said, trying to brush it off. But my heart still pounded, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We made our way down from the lighthouse, the night feeling heavier than before. The walk back to the car was silent. None of us spoke much, the weight of whatever we had seen still lingering in the air. It wasn't until we got back to town and were sitting in the diner, hours later, that things took an even stranger turn. One of my friends, Mark, suddenly leaned forward, his face pale. "Did anyone else feel like we weren't the only ones up there?" His voice was low, almost trembling. We all looked at him, nodding slowly. Every single one of us had the same feeling. That figure we'd seen wasn't something imagined. That figure. What if it wasn't human? I asked quietly, the unease washing over me again. The room grew silent. That's when it hit me. The stories we had dismissed earlier about the lighthouse being haunted came rushing back. What if they were true? What if whatever that figure was had been watching us all night? We never went back to that lighthouse, and even now, I wonder if something still watches from the cliffs at night, waiting for the next visitors to stumble upon its lonely, desolate shores. I was on a road trip with some friends, driving through endless flatlands that stretched out like a forgotten world. It was just us. No towns, no cell service, just miles of dry, cracked earth and endless sky. We had set out from the city, heading towards some isolated national park that none of us had ever visited before. The sun had long since set by the time we realized we were lost. The GPS had been spotty from the beginning, and now, deep in the middle of nowhere, it had completely failed us. The horizon seemed to blur into itself, and the landscape looked more like a dream than reality. No lights from towns, no signs of life, just us and the desolation. As we drove, a fog rolled in, creeping along the ground like something alive. It wasn't cold, just oppressive. The air felt thick, and the quiet was unsettling. We passed what looked like old, rusted-out vehicles, abandoned long before we ever arrived. Each one was a monument to time's relentless march through this forgotten place. Suddenly, the engine sputtered, and the car came to a halt. We sat there, the silence pressing in on us. No wind, no noise, just the hum of our own anxious breathing. "It's out of gas," someone said, breaking the silence. I checked the tank. It was completely empty. The moonlight barely cut through the thick fog, casting everything in an eerie, washed-out glow. We stepped out of the car, the ground dry and cracked beneath our feet. The air was thick, almost like it pressed down on my chest. I felt a cold shiver run through me, but none of us spoke of it. We set out on foot, hoping to find some sign of life, some hint of civilization. The fog thickened as we walked, swirling around us, becoming more like a presence than a natural phenomenon. My friends began to whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something they didn't want to draw attention to. Hours passed in silence, or so it felt. The land seemed endless. The fog never lifted, and there was no relief from it. Eventually, we came across something that didn't fit. An old wooden structure, half buried by the earth, barely visible beneath the thick fog. We cautiously approached, hoping it might provide some shelter or a clue. As we drew closer, I noticed something else: footprints. They were small, almost childlike, leading away from the building and into the darkness. They didn't seem natural, as though someone had deliberately walked there. Inside the structure, we found what remained of a small, forgotten homestead. Rusted tools, cracked furniture, and old, faded photographs of people who were long gone. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying the weight of years gone by. That's when we heard the sound. The faintest whisper. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I realized my friends had stopped moving, frozen, their eyes wide with fear. It came again, more distinct this time. A voice, barely audible, calling from outside. But it wasn't like any voice I'd ever heard. It was not human. It was hollow, distant, as though it came from some place beyond this world. Follow. The voice seemed to echo, twisting through the fog. My friends were visibly shaken. We had to get out of there. We had to run. But the fog was thick, blinding us to our surroundings, and the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. We stumbled back toward the car, but it felt like we were moving in circles. The structure faded behind us, lost in the swirling mists. The voice followed us, always just beyond reach. Eventually, we found ourselves back at the car, and something inside told me we shouldn't get in. But we did. As soon as the doors shut, the fog receded slightly. We could see the road again, though it stretched endlessly, vanishing into the horizon. The drive was long, and the silence oppressive. We didn't speak much. None of us could shake the feeling of being watched, as if the fog had followed us, waiting just out of sight. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. All I know is that something wasn't right, and I pray we never cross paths with whatever it was again. The night it happened, I wasn't even supposed to be there. A few friends and I decided on a spontaneous trip to an abandoned train station. It was old, long forgotten, deep in the woods, miles from civilization. The place had always held a strange allure, a remnant from a past that seemed almost mythical. The tracks were overgrown, the station itself crumbling under years of neglect. We hiked out there with flashlights, excited for the eerie adventure. The walk felt normal at first, just trees, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet, and the sounds of creatures in the woods. It wasn't until we reached the station that the mood shifted. The first thing we noticed was the silence. It wasn't the typical woods silence, the kind where animals go quiet at dusk. This was deeper, as if the forest itself had gone still, like something had pressed pause on the world. Even our own voices felt muted, unnatural. We made our way inside the old building. The walls were stained with mildew, the air thick with the smell of decay. Broken benches and faded posters hung loosely from the walls. Graffiti covered most surfaces, scribbled warnings of danger and decay, but something about it felt different, wrong. We wandered further into the station, and that's when things started to feel off. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light of our flashlights. We heard faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but they seemed to be coming from inside the building, as if they were the echoes of something long gone. I looked at my friends, and we all shared uneasy glances, not sure if we were imagining it or if something truly was there with us. Then, from down the corridor, we heard it, a faint metallic clinking, like something was dragging along the floor. We froze. The sound came again, closer this time, like it was coming toward us. I signaled to my friends to stay still, but before we could even speak, the light flickered above us. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the station, and the air felt charged, like we were standing in the center of some unexplainable tension. We moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. The clinking grew louder, echoing off the cracked walls. It wasn't coming from one of us. Something was there. A figure emerged from the shadows, barely visible but unmistakably human-like. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and it appeared more as a shadow than a person. I stepped back, heart pounding. My friends had already begun to whisper frantically, but none of us could make sense of what we were seeing. The figure didn't seem fully alive. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over bones that looked too sharp, like they didn't belong. Its eyes were hollow, black as night, and it moved toward us without any sign of consciousness or intent. That's when we realized it wasn't human. Panic set in, but we didn't run. We couldn't. It was like the creature had already consumed the world around it, leaving only that suffocating silence. We turned to leave, but the door that had been open earlier was now shut. No breeze, no reason for it to have closed. The creature let out another growl, louder now. closer. We could hear its footsteps dragging along the floor as it approached. It didn't seem to care whether we ran or stayed. It didn't care if we lived or died. It wasn't moving with purpose, but with an unrelenting pull towards something. In that moment, it wasn't just fear that consumed me. It was confusion. What was this thing? What was it after? I don't know how much time passed before it stopped. The growling faded, and the dragging noise was gone. We didn't move. We didn't speak. The shadows grew darker, almost as if they were swallowing the faint glow of our flashlights. When we finally gathered the courage to look again, the station was empty. The door had opened. We walked out into the night, our breaths heavy, and we didn't look back. I've never gone back to that train station. I don't know what we encountered that night, and I don't think I want to. But every time I'm alone, there's always that thought. Whatever it was, it's still out there. I've always loved the quiet of the night. There's something about the stillness that feels peaceful, calming. A few months ago, I took a spontaneous trip to an old abandoned lighthouse perched on the edge of the coast. It wasn't a typical tourist spot, more of a forgotten relic. The lighthouse had been decommissioned years ago, left to crumble under the weight of time and the sea breeze. My friends had backed out, calling the idea too weird, but I was drawn to the solitude. I set out around sunset, carrying only a flashlight and a small backpack with a few essentials. The hike to the lighthouse was long, winding along cliffs that dropped off into the endless ocean below. As I climbed higher, the world seemed to shrink, the noises of civilization fading away. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of pink and orange across the sky. By the time I reached the lighthouse, night had fully taken hold. The structure was towering and silent, its paint chipped and its windows broken. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. It felt like stepping back in time, a place that had been abandoned long before I'd arrived. Inside the lighthouse was just as I imagined, cold and damp, with old wooden beams groaning under the weight of neglect. The air was thick with the smell of mildew. I climbed up the narrow spiral staircase to the top, each creak of the old wooden steps echoing in the empty tower. At the top, the view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out in every direction, the moonlight casting a silver sheen over the waves. I settled in on the edge of the platform, staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. The silence was almost deafening. There was no wind, no crashing waves, just stillness. I was about to close my eyes when I heard it, a faint, distant cry. It was soft, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but not quite. I froze. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. Another cry followed, closer this time. My heart started to race. It wasn't human, not exactly, but it felt close. The sound was strange, almost like a mix of a scream and a moan, drifting up from the base of the lighthouse. I climbed down the stairs slowly, every creak echoing louder than before. I kept my flashlight aimed down, scanning the shadows as I went. The sound seemed to be coming from below, beneath the lighthouse. It wasn't an animal, not the wind. It was something else entirely. When I reached the bottom, the cries had stopped. The air felt colder, more oppressive. I walked around the structure, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The silence returned, almost suffocating. That's when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. Movement. A figure stood just at the edge of the cliff, barely visible in the dark. I squinted, but they didn't move. They were watching, unmoving, just standing there. My breath hitched as I pointed the flashlight toward them. For a moment, I thought it was a person, but there was something off. The figure wasn't human. The light only illuminated their outline, distorted and strange, as if they didn't belong in this world. Panic clawed at me. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the loose gravel. I didn't stop until I reached the car, my chest heaving with each breath. When I glanced back at the lighthouse, it was silent. The figure was gone. I still don't know what I saw that night. All I know is, I never returned to the lighthouse. Some things are better left untouched, left to the silence and the darkness where they belong. It started on a quiet summer evening. I was driving down the winding country road, away from the lights of the city and toward the small rural town I called home. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a deep, orange glow behind the trees. I wasn't in a rush. The journey was peaceful. Nothing but open fields stretching out on either side of the road. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, just a text from a friend reminding me to take the back route. The usual traffic's a nightmare, they'd said. I smiled and checked the screen. Sure enough, there were no cars ahead, no one behind me. The road was empty. As I drove deeper into the countryside, I felt the weight of the quiet settle around me. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of distant crickets. I took a deep breath, letting the calmness wash over me. It was so different from the chaos of the city. It was peaceful. That's when I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just someone waiting for a ride, but as I got closer, I realized how still they were. The figure didn't move. No wave, no glance, just standing there, perfectly still, like a mannequin. I passed them without slowing down, my pulse quickening. I told myself they were probably just lost, maybe hitchhiking. But the image of that unmoving figure stuck with me. A few miles further, I came across another one, and this time closer to the edge of a small, overgrown field. The figure stood just a few feet from the road, completely still, staring off into the distance. I passed by, this time slower, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. There were more. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, I had counted 5. All of them standing still at the side of the road, staring into the darkness, unmoving. I was just about to dismiss the whole thing when a shiver ran down my spine. What if they weren't people? What if they weren't even real? I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. Not just standing there waiting, but following. It wasn't until I was almost home that I realized something else. They hadn't moved. I made it back safe, but the silence of that night, the sight of those figures, still haunts me. I still drive that road sometimes, hoping to find some explanation, but I never do. I'll never forget that summer afternoon when I went for a hike. I wasn't a hiker, far from it. I was out of shape, but the trails near the mountains had always called to me. The air was warm, the sun was bright, and the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. I decided to take a trail that led deeper into the woods, away from the main paths and the familiar sounds of civilization. At first, everything seemed perfect. The birds chirped, the trees rustled gently in the breeze, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I wasn't exactly sure where I was going, but I didn't care. It felt freeing to be away from the constant noise of phones, people, and the city. I walked for hours, letting my thoughts drift as I lost track of time. Then, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't sudden, more like the gradual descent into something off. The birds stopped singing, and the forest became eerily silent. The air felt heavier, thicker. The light filtering through the trees seemed dimmer, almost unnatural. I noticed the shadows stretching longer than they should have, growing darker, more menacing. My stomach twisted. I stopped and looked around, unsure why I felt so uncomfortable. Everything seemed the same. Trees, rocks, the trail, but something wasn't right. My instinct screamed that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned in a circle, scanning the forest. There was no one, just the trees, endless and unchanging. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt eyes on me, watching. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail curved ahead, leading deeper into the woods, but I didn't want to go any farther. I wanted to turn back. My breath grew ragged, and with each step the sense of being followed only grew stronger. Then I heard it, The faintest whisper, just on the edge of hearing. It sounded like my name, softly spoken, carried on the wind. I froze. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The forest was still, except for the sound of my own breathing. My head was spinning, and my chest felt tight. I kept walking, but every instinct in me told me to turn around and leave. I glanced back once, and for a moment I could swear I saw something. Just a flash of movement, disappearing behind a tree. My pace quickened, and as I did, the whispers began again, louder this time. They surrounded me, coming from all directions. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of them sent chills down my spine. Panic gripped me. I wasn't thinking straight anymore. I ran. The trail twisted and turned, but I couldn't see the end. The woods felt endless, and the deeper I went, the darker everything became. I could barely make out the path beneath my feet. Then I heard it again. A voice, closer this time, clearer, more distinct. "Turn back," it said, but it wasn't human. It was hollow, distorted, like the echo of something long dead. "Leave this place." I stumbled, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't care about the trail anymore. Nothing mattered except getting out. My mind was screaming for answers, but I knew there weren't any. Suddenly, I burst out of the trees into a clearing. My eyes widened. There, in front of me, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, with skin that seemed to ripple like smoke. Its eyes were black, hollow, and empty. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with a cold, unsettling stare. I stopped, paralyzed by fear. My breath hitched and my legs felt like they would give out. But something inside me told me to run. I had to get away. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, but the forest seemed endless. Every shadow felt alive, every noise a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, something that had followed me from the moment I stepped off the trail. Hours later, I made it out. I don't remember much of the journey back, only that I kept running, not knowing if I'd ever escape. To this day, I don't know what that figure was or why it followed me. The forest isn't the same to me anymore. There's a quiet, lingering fear every time I step into the woods, a reminder of that day when I became lost in a world I couldn't explain. It was late October, the leaves crunching beneath my feet as I made my way down the quiet country road. I had decided to take a long walk that evening, needing some fresh air away from the dull hum of city life. The sun was setting, casting long dark shadows over the rolling hills, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of trees in the breeze. I'd grown up in this area, a small town surrounded by farmland and open spaces. The woods were always eerie at night, but tonight felt different. The air was colder, heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I walked, I noticed how distant the usual sounds of animals had become. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Even the wind had quieted. I reached the edge of the woods, the trees towering like silent sentinels on either side of the road. The sun had nearly set now, leaving only a dim orange glow on the horizon. It was too early to be this dark. That's when I saw it, standing between two trees, perfectly still, a figure watching me from the shadows. It was human-shaped, but there was something off about it. Its posture was wrong, unnatural. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure if I should move or run. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It was like something out of a nightmare, just a shadow in the fading light. My legs felt frozen as I tried to look away, but something held my gaze. Who's there? My voice trembled as I forced the words out. The silence stretched on, and then nothing. No response, no sound of breathing, no movement. I wanted to run. I turned back toward the road, but as I did, I saw another figure appear in the distance, emerging from the opposite side of the woods. This one was even closer, closer than I thought possible. It didn't walk, it glided, silently, effortlessly. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't human. The shape was wrong, distorted, like something had stretched it out of proportion. My mind raced as I backed away, hands trembling, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was nearly at the edge of the road. The two figures, now several feet apart, stood motionless, their black, empty eyes staring toward me. I realized, with a sick feeling in my stomach, that I hadn't heard any footsteps, just silence. And yet they were there, both of them, in the middle of nowhere, watching me. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could, the figures vanishing into the darkness behind me. I never looked back. To this day, I don't know what they were, but I know they weren't human. It started as an ordinary Sunday drive through the countryside. I'd packed a few snacks, some music, and planned to spend the day exploring the old back roads, places I hadn't visited in years. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the fields as I drove along, lost in the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds. My destination was a small, forgotten town deep in the woods. It wasn't marked on any maps or GPS. It was one of those places that only showed up if you knew where to look. I had vague memories of visiting there as a kid, but everything had changed since then. The road wound tighter into the trees, and as I drove deeper, the world felt as if it was folding in around me. I was eager for the quiet, for a break from the city, but the stillness of the woods began to feel oppressive, almost too quiet. It was as though the trees were watching, the silence pressing down like a weight. Eventually, I reached the old town, or what was left of it. Time had all but erased it. The town was overgrown with vines, the wooden houses leaning in on themselves, abandoned and forgotten. There were no signs of life, no people, no vehicles, just a faint echo of the past. I parked my car near the edge of what was once Main Street and started walking. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, cracked and covered in weeds. The air smelled damp and musty, like something had been left to rot. I passed the old general store, its windows broken and faded posters peeling away. I peeked inside and saw remnants of a life long gone, dusty shelves, faded signs, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Something about it made my skin crawl, but curiosity drove me forward. I wandered through the town, stumbling over old bricks and rusted metal, feeling as though I was stepping through a memory. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, my footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls, the creak of dry wood, the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, yet unsettling. As the sun began to set, I reached the outskirts of town. I sat on an old stone bench, trying to take in the view of the overgrown fields and the distant horizon. The quiet seemed to stretch forever, the woods pressing closer with each passing moment. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. A whisper. It wasn't human, but something inhuman. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods remained silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The whisper grew louder, as if it was circling around me, distant but persistent. I stood, my hands trembling, and turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. The woods were darkening, the last light of day vanishing behind the trees. Then, just beyond the edge of my vision, I saw it. Movement. A shadow, shifting among the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, and its figure twisted unnaturally as if it didn't belong in the world. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The whisper became a soft, eerie chant now, growing louder and more insistent. The figure moved closer, the shadows stretching and twisting as it approached. I could feel its presence, as if it were staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. It was something older, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled backward. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. The figure was no longer a shape, but a dark void, surrounding me in silence and fear. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the whisper faded. The figure stood still for a moment, then turned, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had come. I stood there, trembling, as the night fully set in. The woods were silent once again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That thing, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. I slowly made my way back to my car, heart still racing. As I drove away, I glanced back at the town once more, the memories of the whisper still echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back since. It was a quiet evening in my apartment, the kind where the city feels distant despite being just outside the window. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant car passing by. I had just settled in for the night, the blinds drawn and the dim glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. I wasn't sure how long I had been sitting there when I noticed something strange. It was faint at first, a whispering sound, barely audible, like someone was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the wind or some noise from the neighbors. But it wasn't just outside the window. It was inside my apartment. I listened closer, holding my breath. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from any specific direction, but rather seemed to be coming from everywhere. It felt like the walls were alive, the air itself vibrating with those strange, unintelligible sounds. I got up and moved toward the hallway, my footsteps echoing faintly. The whispers followed, as if they were inside my head. I turned on the hallway light, hoping it would stop whatever was making that sound, but the light did nothing. The whispers continued, now more persistent, almost like they were speaking my name. The sound was almost melodic, but there was something eerie about it, something off. I decided to step into my bedroom and close the door behind me. The moment I did, the whispers stopped. It was quiet again, the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, this time, more clear, coming from just outside the door. "Let me in." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't like any sound I've ever heard before. It was low, hollow, almost mechanical, but filled with an unnatural urgency. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my entire body trembling. "Let me in," the voice repeated, louder this time, like it was right outside the door. I could feel the floor beneath me shaking slightly, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I tried to call the police. The line rang and rang, but no one answered. The phone died, the screen flickering, leaving me in total silence once again. The whispers started again, this time from deeper inside the apartment, coming from the shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor like living things. They didn't make any sense, but they were there, filling the air with a sense of dread that I couldn't escape. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my room, with the door locked, listening to those whispers, until the first light of dawn broke through my blinds. When morning finally came, everything was quiet. No signs of anything strange. My apartment looked the same, as if nothing had happened. But the whispers, they haven't stopped. I still hear them sometimes, late at night when the city noise dies down and the silence takes over. I don't know what they are, but I know they're still there, waiting. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. It was an ordinary Saturday when we decided to explore the old lake. It wasn't just any lake, it was surrounded by dense woods, hidden far from the main road. My friends and I had stumbled upon it years ago while hiking, but never spent much time there. Today, curiosity got the better of us. We packed a picnic and drove out, eager to spend the afternoon away from the usual noise of the city. The day was perfect at first. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and the lake itself was calm and inviting. We set up our blankets near the shore, and for a few hours it felt like the world had stopped. We swam, took photos, and laughed under the canopy of trees. The forest around us seemed alive, buzzing with insects and birds. But there was something else, something that felt off. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, we began to hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, like voices carried from the depths of the woods. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to hear it. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They shook their heads, focused on the lake. I stood up, looking toward the trees. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and now I was certain I wasn't imagining it. They weren't words, just faint, distorted murmurs, like something from a dream, calling out from the forest. "We should go back," I said, my heart starting to race. The feeling of unease was creeping in, swallowing any sense of peace we had earlier. "No way," one of my friends laughed. "We've got another hour of daylight, we're fine." I hesitated, wanting to stay but feeling that nagging, primal instinct to get out. Still, we stayed a little longer, hoping the sounds would fade. But they didn't. It was like the forest was alive, its very trees whispering to each other. The murmurs were all around us now, growing louder, almost like they were speaking directly to us. One of my friends, Mark, turned white as he stared at the woods, his eyes wide and searching. "I swear I hear something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not normal." I glanced at the others. None of them seemed to be reacting as strongly, but I could see the tension in their faces. The air had turned colder and the woods were shifting. Silent one moment, then alive with rustling leaves and distant sounds. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, casting the area in shadows. Everything seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. Mark stood up, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." The others agreed, though reluctantly. We quickly packed our things, keeping our eyes on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from them. The whispers grew louder as we walked toward the car, but no one spoke, too caught up in the creeping dread. When we reached the car, I turned back one last time, searching the forest for any sign of life. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It wasn't human, though. It was long and twisted, like a shadow, but with shape. It vanished in an instant, but I knew it had been watching us. My friends didn't see it, and I didn't say a word. I just got in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. We drove away from the lake in silence, leaving the strange murmurs behind us. As we drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the darkness. I've never been back to that lake, and I never planned to. Whatever was out there, it felt alive, watching, waiting. And I know now, some things are better left unexplored. I was always someone who believed in the familiar, the predictable. My life had always been about routine, and I liked it that way. That's why, when my friend convinced me to take a road trip to an old remote lighthouse for the weekend, I wasn't thrilled, but I went along anyway. It wasn't the kind of place I'd ever consider visiting, but something about the isolation appealed to my friend, and I didn't want to miss out. The lighthouse was situated on a rugged coastline, far from civilization. The drive there took hours, and as we approached, the only sounds were the wind and the crashing waves below. There were no other cars on the road, no other people. It felt as if we had stepped into a world that no one else remembered. When we finally reached the lighthouse, we parked and began our hike up the steep, crumbling path that led to the base. The wind was strong, biting through our jackets as we made our way to the top. The view from the lighthouse was breathtaking. Vast, empty stretches of ocean and rocky cliffs stretching into the horizon. We spent the day exploring the area, taking photos, and marveling at how quiet everything was. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the land, we decided to climb inside the lighthouse. The door creaked open, and the smell of old, damp wood hit us. Inside, the old spiral staircase wound up into darkness. We climbed carefully, each step echoing louder than before. The higher we went, the colder it became. I had a strange sensation that something, was watching us from the shadows below. When we reached the top, the wind howled louder than ever. The view was incredible, but the feeling of being completely alone started to gnaw at my thoughts. The sky was painted in deep purples and oranges, and the ocean stretched endlessly before us. It was peaceful, yet something felt off. As we explored the small room at the top of the lighthouse, we found old, faded charts and logs, abandoned years ago. The emptiness was almost overwhelming. I kept glancing behind me, as if expecting to see someone, or something, watching from the corners of the room. We stayed until the sun had fully set, but as the darkness deepened, my unease grew. The wind had died down now, leaving a heavy silence. It felt as though the world had stopped turning. My friend began to pack up, but I stayed by the window staring at the horizon, waiting for something that I couldn't put into words. It wasn't until I was about to leave the room that I noticed something strange. On one of the old, dusty tables by the window, there was a single, neatly folded piece of paper. I almost missed it, but something about the way it seemed out of place drew my attention. Curious, I unfolded it. It wasn't a log or any kind of note I could make sense of. The writing was old and faded, but as I read it, a chill ran down my spine. They watch. They listen. Always. We begged for help, but there was no one left to hear. They took them all. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around the empty room, my eyes scanning the shadows. The silence felt heavier than ever, and my pulse began to race. I wasn't alone. I tucked the paper into my jacket, and we left the lighthouse as quickly as we could, the weight of what I had read pressing down on me. The drive back was quiet, but every shadow seemed to whisper in my mind, and the thought of that unknown presence stayed with me long after we left. To this day, I still wonder who wrote that note, and what it meant. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to go for a drive. I had been feeling restless lately, and the open road seemed like the perfect escape. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and drove aimlessly, taking whatever turns felt right. Eventually, I found myself deep in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. The roads twisted and turned, surrounded by nothing but trees and fields. The further I drove, the quieter it became. No cars, no people, just the hum of the engine and the distant chirp of birds. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After a while, I came across an old farmhouse. Its paint was peeling and the windows were dark and empty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled up beside the house, parking a little ways off the dusty driveway. I sat there for a moment, staring at the abandoned building. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right. I decided to get out and take a closer look. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I approached the front door. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface. The house smelled old, like something had been left to rot inside. My breath fogged up the cracked window and I peered inside. It was empty, completely stripped of life. Chairs lay overturned, curtains torn and hanging in tatters. It was as if the house had been waiting for someone to return. As I wandered through the house, a strange feeling settled over me. The air was still, almost too still. It felt as if I wasn't alone. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I called out, but no answer came. It was like the world had gone silent. the kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if something is breathing just beyond it. Upstairs, I found a room at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, creaking when I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with faded furniture and more cobwebs. On the wall was a single photograph, worn and faded, its edges curling up. A family stood there, smiling, though their eyes seemed hollow, their grins fake. The photo sent a chill down my spine. Then I heard a sound from below, a faint, distant thud. My heart skipped a beat. I listened, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking through the house. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps came from downstairs, echoing up the creaking staircase. I should have run. I knew that. But my legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me. Then I heard it. The sound of something else. A faint, whispering voice. I couldn't make out the words, just the soft murmur as if someone was speaking in another language. It came from below, growing louder, as if whatever it was had found its way into the house. Tears filled my eyes as I forced myself to move. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to go back to the front door. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I moved slowly down the stairs, each creak beneath my feet sounding louder than the last. At the front door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I had never been more afraid in my life. The whispers had grown so loud, they felt like they were in my head. I turned the knob, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the daylight. The house looked different from the outside, somehow darker, more twisted. I expected to see someone standing there watching me, but there was nothing, just the empty fields stretching out before me. The whispering faded, and the silence returned. I drove away without looking back. The house stayed with me, though. The image of that photograph, the whispering voice, it all felt too real. I don't know what I experienced that day, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. It started with the sound of dripping water. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone like any other night. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I live alone, so when I first heard it, I thought maybe it was the refrigerator or the old pipes settling. I got up and checked the kitchen, but the dripping didn't seem to be coming from there. I stood still, listening, and it was coming from upstairs. I didn't think much of it at first. Old houses settle, right? Water can be unpredictable. But the sound persisted, steady and rhythmic. A slow, steady drip that seemed to echo throughout the empty house. I made my way upstairs, my footsteps quiet on the carpet, and checked the bathroom. No leaks. The sound was faint but clear now, coming from the end of the hallway. I stood there, staring down the dark corridor, wondering if maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, it wasn't in my head. It was too consistent, too real. I slowly pushed open the door to the guest room at the end of the hall. That was where the sound was loudest. The room was dark, dusty, and untouched. I flicked on the light switch and the faint glow illuminated the space. The room had been unused for years. An old dresser, a dusty bed frame, and a broken lamp in the corner. Nothing had changed. I listened again. The dripping was definitely coming from inside the room, but this time it wasn't coming from a pipe. It was coming from the closet. I took a deep breath, my pulse quickening, and slowly made my way toward it. The sound of my own breathing seemed louder than the drip, drip, drip. My hand hesitated on the closet door, and then I pulled it open. The inside was dark and empty, except for something unexpected, a single wet patch on the floor. A puddle, but not a puddle of water. It shimmered in the dim light, almost like it wasn't water at all. I knelt down, my heart racing, and touched it. My fingers sank into the substance. It was cold, sticky, and unidentifiable. I pulled my hand away, wiping it on my jeans, and stared into the closet. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse at first. A shape, a figure standing at the back of the closet, facing away from me. It didn't move, didn't react. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of a figure distorted and shifting in the dim light. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stared, unable to look away. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. The silence stretched on, and then, slowly, the figure turned toward me. Its face wasn't human. No eyes, no features, just void. A hollow, dark space where a face should have been. I could feel its gaze on me, and that's when I realized it wasn't there for water or pipes or anything rational. It had been there for me. I forced myself to turn and stumble out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The dripping sound still echoed through my house, but this time, it felt like it was coming from inside me. I still live in that house. The dripping never stopped. I've learned to ignore it, but sometimes, when the house grows too quiet, I swear I can hear the faint sound of footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A group of friends and I decided to spend the day at the lake, looking forward to some sun, swimming, and grilling burgers. We had rented a small cabin by the water, tucked away from the main shore, surrounded by tall trees. The plan was to relax and enjoy the quiet, but things quickly went south. We arrived early in the morning, and the place was exactly as we'd pictured: peaceful, remote, far from the noise of civilization. We set up camp near the lake, took out the boats, and spent the first half of the day swimming and joking around. The water was cool and refreshing, and we all felt content. Around midday, we decided to take a hike along the trail that followed the shoreline. The trees stretched high above us, casting long shadows over the dirt path. We walked for about an hour, laughing and pointing out strange-looking rocks or trees that had been twisted by the wind. It was nice, peaceful even. That's when it happened. We came across an old, weathered sign that pointed off the trail. "No trespassing," it read. We hesitated for a moment, unsure if we should follow it. Curiosity got the better of us, and one of us, the bravest or perhaps the most reckless, led the way. The trail disappeared into thick undergrowth. The trees grew closer together, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was eerily quiet now, with only the faint rustling of leaves as the wind shifted. We walked for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing down on us. Suddenly, we stopped. The trail ended abruptly in front of us, but it wasn't just a dead end. It was as if something had been cleared away, as though we weren't meant to go any further. The ground was packed hard, with claw marks etched into the earth as if something had been dragged through there. My stomach twisted at the sight. We turned back, uneasy now. As we retraced our steps, we realized the forest felt wrong. The air was thick, colder somehow, and the silence was oppressive. I could hear my friends breathing, each breath sharp and shallow. The usual sounds of birds and insects had vanished. When we made it back to the lake, the cabin was still in sight, but something had changed. The sunlight seemed dimmer, the air colder. It wasn't until we were nearly back that we noticed it. Someone had followed us. At first, I thought it was just one of our own shadows, but when I turned to glance behind us, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, far away but clear enough to make out. It wasn't moving, just watching. We didn't speak. We just bolted toward the cabin, leaving the figure behind. Inside, we locked all the doors and windows, hearts racing. We tried to convince ourselves it was just someone from a neighboring cabin, maybe a hiker who had wandered off trail. But deep down, we knew better. The figure had been watching us, waiting. The rest of the day passed in a blur of silence and paranoia. We didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin made us jump. We knew whatever had followed us was still out there, waiting in the dark. By morning, the figure was gone, but the fear remained. Whatever had followed us wasn't human, or at least not anymore. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just me, my wife, and our old tent. We had decided to spend the weekend camping at a quiet spot far from town, a remote forest preserve where we hadn't been before. No phone service, no distractions, just nature. We had always loved the quiet, the peace. That night, we pitched our tent by the edge of a small misty lake. The sound of frogs croaking and the distant rustling of leaves filled the air. For a while, everything felt perfect. As darkness fell, we sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and chatting about nothing in particular. The forest was alive with sounds, the occasional hoot of an owl, the scuttling of small animals in the underbrush. But there was one sound that didn't fit. Something soft and irregular, almost mechanical. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was the wind. But then it stopped, only to start again, closer this time. It was a faint rhythmic thud, like someone lightly tapping a tree. I glanced around, but the woods were dark and quiet, save for that strange noise. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "What's that noise?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My wife furrowed her brow, listening intently. "I don't know. It's probably just something out there." I didn't believe her. The tapping wasn't like any natural sound we'd heard before. It felt deliberate, almost as if something, or someone, was pacing the perimeter of our campsite. "We should head to bed," I suggested, trying to mask my unease. We snuffed out the fire and climbed into the tent, pulling the flaps closed behind us. The sound followed us. The rhythmic tapping continued, now louder, more insistent. It wasn't far. It was coming from just beyond the edge of the trees, and whatever it wasn't stopping. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every few minutes I woke, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound seemed closer now, more deliberate. The faint rustling of leaves wasn't wind, it was movement. Then something shifted in the darkness. I saw it, a pair of pale eyes staring at us from between the trees. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. I held my breath, frozen with fear. My wife stirred beside me, unaware of the figure just outside the tent. I could barely hear her breathing over the pounding of my heart. After what felt like hours, the eyes blinked and vanished. The tapping stopped. The forest went silent again, but this time, the silence was worse. In the morning, we crept out of the tent, both of us pale and exhausted. The forest was still, but something felt off, unnaturally still. My wife pointed at the ground, her voice trembling. "Footprints," she said. I followed her gaze to the soft earth around our campsite. There were clear, human-like footprints leading away from the tent and into the woods, but they didn't belong to us. We never found out what was watching us that night. We packed our things and left the forest behind, leaving the strange footprints and the silent eyes in the dark. To this day, I wonder what might have happened if we hadn't left. I was on a road trip with my friends, driving through an unfamiliar desert. The sun was beating down on the cracked pavement, and the silence of the empty highway stretched endlessly ahead. We had been driving for hours. No signs of civilization in sight, just mile after mile of barren desert landscape. We were all growing restless, desperate for some kind of break from the monotony. The only thing in view was the occasional stretch of cracked road in the distant horizon, where the desert seemed to blend into the sky. My friends and I decided to pull off onto a small dirt track we'd seen about a mile back. The track led to an old abandoned building, once a gas station, now nothing but rubble and dust. The sun had bleached the place dry, leaving only broken windows and faded remnants of faded signage. It looked like it had been there for decades, forgotten by time. "We should check it out," Mark said, breaking the silence. We cautiously made our way through the debris, the crunch of our footsteps disturbing the quiet. The inside of the building was eerily quiet. The dust that coated everything made it feel like the place hadn't seen human presence in a lifetime. We explored the remains, poking through old cabinets and peeling wallpaper, but found nothing of any real value. That's when we noticed it. At first, we didn't know what it was. A faint metallic hum, like something electrical, coming from somewhere deeper inside the building. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't subtle either. We followed the sound down what was left of the hallway, the old wooden floor creaking beneath us. At the end of the hall, we found a door that was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, we saw a narrow staircase leading down into a dark basement. The hum grew louder as we descended, the air growing colder with each step. I could feel the tension rising in my chest, the kind that makes your skin crawl. The basement was a mess. Collapsed shelves, broken tools scattered across the floor. But the hum wasn't coming from any of that. It was coming from an old metal door at the far end of the room. The door was covered in rust with no visible handle. Mark walked toward it, his flashlight shaking slightly as he pointed it at the door. "What is this thing?" he muttered. I didn't know. None of us did. The hum grew almost unbearable as we got closer. My heart was pounding in my chest as I realized there was something on the other side. I reached out, placing my hand on the door. The noise stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I turned to the others, but they were frozen, staring at me like I was the only one who could move. Then something changed. A faint scraping noise began. It came from behind the door, slow and deliberate, as if something on the other side was dragging itself closer. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark's eyes were wide, his flashlight now trembling more violently. "Open the door," he managed to choke out. I hesitated. I didn't want to. But the scraping was getting louder, the sound of something, or someone, dragging itself across the floor behind the metal door. Without realizing what I was doing, I turned the knob. The door swung open. There was nothing, at least not anything we could see. The room beyond was empty, just more dust, darkness, and a strange, inexplicable silence. But as I stepped forward, I felt something cold, like fingers brushing against my back. It wasn't just a sensation. It was as if something was there, something that didn't belong. My friends weren't behind me anymore. I turned to call out to them, but they were gone. The basement was empty and the metal door was still open behind me. I couldn't explain what happened. I never could. I looked for them after that, searched the entire area, but there was no trace. No sign of my friends, no footprints, nothing. To this day, I wonder what we found in that desert. Whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. It was late at night, and I was driving home from a family gathering. The roads were mostly empty, the only sound being the occasional hum of my tires on the asphalt. I wasn't particularly familiar with this route. My usual path was blocked off due to some road work, but it was the quickest detour I could take. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the landscape changed. The city lights faded behind me, leaving only dark fields and dense trees. The silence grew oppressive. I had this strange feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, but I brushed it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. About 20 minutes into the detour, I passed a small, ancient-looking church. Its steeple pierced through the night sky, its silhouette standing stark against the dim moonlight. The church looked abandoned, with vines creeping up its sides, and the windows were shattered, filled with dirt and cobwebs. I shivered despite the warm breeze. As I drove by, my headlights briefly illuminated the graveyard surrounding the church. Tombstones leaned at odd angles, some half buried in the earth. The whole scene felt eerily still, like it wasn't part of this world. I tried to shake the unease that settled in my stomach and pressed on, telling myself it was just an old church. It was the next turn that unnerved me. The road curved sharply into a dense forest. The trees loomed high, their branches interlocking like dark claws above me. The air grew colder, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. My headlights barely cut through the fog that had begun to roll in. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The feeling that I was being watched grew stronger. I kept telling myself I was overthinking things, but my pulse quickened with each passing second. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A low, hollow whispering. It was so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it, but it repeated, clear as day. Follow. I froze. The whisper wasn't coming from inside the car. It seemed to be carried on the wind, drifting from the trees around me. My fingers went numb as I clutched the steering wheel tighter. I scanned the forest, searching for the source, but the trees were motionless, their shadows stretching endlessly. Follow. This time, it was closer. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to drive away, but my foot wouldn't move. I didn't know if it was fear or something else keeping me there. Suddenly, my headlights flickered. The noise of the engine seemed to fade into the whispering. I could barely hear the tires on the road beneath me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible through the thick fog. Its outline was dark and impossibly tall. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I should have turned around then, should have left, but my body felt paralyzed. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Follow. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Without thinking, I found myself inching the car forward, the figure still staring, unmoving. It was like it was beckoning me, luring me deeper into the unknown. I don't know how long I drove. The road twisted and turned, every mile feeling longer than the last. The whisper didn't stop, growing louder, as if I were being led deeper into the woods, into whatever nightmare lurked ahead. Finally, the whisper faded. The trees grew thinner. The fog cleared slightly, and I found myself driving onto a dirt path. Ahead of me was a clearing, bathed in moonlight. In the center stood the church, its shattered windows now gleaming with an otherworldly glow. My heart pounded as I realized the figure was gone. I hesitated, my hands still gripping the wheel, but something compelled me to stop. I didn't know why. My legs felt like they were moving on their own. I stepped out of the car, the ground beneath my feet cold and wet. I approached the church, the whisper now replaced by silence. My footsteps echoed in the stillness. When I reached the church, I stared at the cracked entrance, frozen with fear. But there was nothing. No figure, no whispers, no voices, just an old, abandoned church standing in the cold, dead night. And as I turned to leave, I realized the face I had seen in the cracked window wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. It was the kind of day that felt too perfect to be real, the kind of day you only ever see in old photos or travel brochures. My friends and I decided to take a trip out to a secluded beach, tucked away from the usual tourist spots. We'd heard whispers of its beauty from a few locals, but no one really talked about what else might be there. We didn't care. We just wanted the peace and quiet. The drive there was uneventful, winding through winding, narrow roads that twisted through dense forests. The radio played softly, our conversations mellow, as we joked about what kind of adventures awaited us at the shore. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. We finally reached the beach in the late afternoon, the sun already low on the horizon. The sand stretched out in front of us, golden and untouched. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore was soothing. For the first time in a long time, we truly felt free. We spent the day swimming, building sandcastles, and exploring the tide pools. It was idyllic. But as the sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the sand, something started to feel off. The beach, once full of laughter and cheer, grew quiet. The air seemed to thicken, the usual comforting sounds of waves and birds fading into silence. It wasn't that we felt unwelcome, just uneasy, like something was watching. As the last light of the day faded, we gathered our things. feeling reluctant to leave the peaceful stretch of shore behind. I was about to suggest we head back when one of my friends, Laura, stopped dead in her tracks. "Wait, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. We all stopped and strained to listen. At first, it was just the sound of the ocean, but then I realized she wasn't talking about the waves. There was something else. A faint, rhythmic thudding. Soft, but insistent. Like something hitting the ground, just beyond the edge of the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my stomach tightening. We couldn't see anything, just the dark silhouettes of trees looming beyond the beach. The sound grew louder, closer, and now I was sure I could hear another noise. Whispers. Low, unintelligible voices like they were murmuring right at the edge of hearing. "I think we should go," one of my other friends, Mike, said, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Maybe someone's camping out there," Laura suggested, but her words trembled as she spoke. The thudding noise stopped abruptly and the whispers fell silent. A sudden chill swept through the air. It felt like something had just moved, watching us from the darkness. "I think we should go now," I said, my voice firm. The fear in the air was impossible to ignore. We started walking quickly toward the car parked at the edge of the forest. My mind was racing. What could have made that noise? What had those whispers been? As we neared the edge of the woods, something caught my eye. A figure just beyond the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. It was dark, featureless, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I stopped, unable to look away. "Come on," Mike yelled from a few steps ahead. I blinked, shaking my head. The figure was gone. We piled into the car, driving quickly away from the beach. The silence inside was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. None of us spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. That feeling, the sensation of being watched, hadn't left any of us. It wasn't until we were back in town that Laura spoke up again, her voice breaking the silence. "I've never told anyone this, but when I was walking down the beach earlier, I saw something in the water," she said quietly. A face, floating beneath the surface. It wasn't human. We all fell silent. None of us had seen the face she mentioned, but somehow I wasn't surprised. What we heard, what we saw, whatever it was still there, watching from the shadows of the trees. To this day, I haven't returned to that beach. And I never will. I still don't know how it started. I was on a family trip, just a quiet weekend getaway to an old, abandoned lighthouse by the sea. The kind of place that was supposed to be peaceful, isolated from everything, with nothing but the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. It was just me, my parents, and my sister. The lighthouse towered over us, weathered by time and ocean spray, its white paint flaking off like skin peeling from old wounds. The first day, everything seemed normal. We explored the surrounding cliffs, took photos of the rocky coastline, and enjoyed the solitude. But as night fell, something shifted. We'd set up camp near the base of the lighthouse, far enough away from the cliffs to feel safe, but close enough that the ocean was always within earshot. It was late when I went to sleep, the air thick with the scent of salt and damp earth. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was my parents or sister talking, but when I opened my eyes, I was alone. The tent was silent except for the crashing waves. Still, the voices continued, low murmurs, too faint to make out but unmistakably there, just outside the tent. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe I was dreaming. I lay there, frozen, trying to ignore it. But then the whispering stopped, and I heard footsteps, soft and deliberate, creeping around the outside of the tent. My heart pounded as I gripped the edge of the sleeping bag. I wanted to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. The footsteps circled the tent, slower now, as if they were inspecting it. The rustling of grass sounded too close, like someone was brushing against the fabric. I forced myself to stay still, waiting for the footsteps to fade. But they didn't. Instead, they grew louder, dragging closer until they were right beside me. I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, shallow and uneven, like someone struggling to stay quiet. Then, out of nowhere, a deep, hollow voice spoke. "Let me in." I couldn't scream. My breath hitched as I stared at the fabric of the tent, the sound of the voice lingering in my ears. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Terror gripped me, but I managed to unzip the tent a little, just enough to peek outside. The moonlight barely cut through the darkness, but I could make out a figure standing there. Its shape was distorted, almost unnatural. Too tall, too thin, with skin that shimmered under the moonlight like water. Its face was obscured, shrouded in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would disappear if I couldn't see it. When I opened them again, the figure was gone. The footsteps had stopped, and the silence returned. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my sister's hand when she woke up too. None of us spoke of what happened. We packed up quietly at dawn, trying to act like nothing was out of the ordinary. To this day, I can still hear those whispers. They haunt me every time I hear the ocean. Whatever was out there didn't follow us home, but I know it's still out there, waiting.
But the wind didn't make whispers like that soft, almost melodic, as if they were calling to me. When we reached the bottom of the trail, I was relieved to be back on solid ground. But as we were walking back to our car, something stopped me. I glanced back toward the lighthouse, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. At the top of the stairs, just for a split second, I saw a figure, a silhouette. It wasn't solid, more like a shadow against the fading light. It seemed to be watching us, standing perfectly still. My stomach twisted, and I called out to my friends, but they were already too far ahead. By the time they turned back, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. Even now, weeks later, I still hear the whispers, sometimes faint and distant, like they're always just beyond my reach. The lighthouse may be gone, but whatever it is that watched us from the top, it's still out there. The stairs spiraled up the side of the cliff, worn and partially collapsed, but we made it to the top without much difficulty. The view was breathtaking, the vast expanse of ocean stretching out endlessly beneath us. We felt like we were on top of the world. As we explored the interior of the lighthouse, I noticed something strange. It wasn't just the cracked and broken furniture or the dust-covered rooms. There was an overwhelming sense of stillness. The air felt thick, and it seemed like the walls were watching us. It was then that we heard it, a faint, echoing sound, as though someone was whispering from far away. I stood still, straining my ears, trying to make sense of the noise. My friends didn't seem to notice, too busy taking pictures of the breathtaking view. "Did you hear that?" I asked, but no one seemed to respond. They brushed it off, assuming I was imagining things. But the sound wasn't just in my head, it was real, persistent, and getting louder. As we made our way back down, the whispers continued, growing louder, more distinct. I tried to keep calm, convinced that it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but the wind didn't make whispers like that, soft, almost melodic, as if they were calling to me. When we reached the bottom of the trail, I was relieved to be back on solid ground. But as we were walking back to our car, something stopped me. I glanced back toward the lighthouse, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. At the top of the stairs, just for a split second, I saw a figure, a silhouette. It wasn't solid, more like a shadow against the fading light. It seemed to be watching us, standing perfectly still. My stomach twisted, and I called out to my friends, but they were already too far ahead. By the time they turned back, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. Even now, weeks later, I still hear the whispers, sometimes faint and distant, like they're always just beyond my reach. The lighthouse may be gone, but whatever it is that watched us from the top, It's still out there. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The sound of my footsteps faded into the endless crashing of waves. But the figure was still there, moving, growing closer with every step I took. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled to start the engine, my hands trembling. When I finally glanced up, the figure was gone, but I swear, I still feel its eyes watching me every time I close my eyes. I can see it. It's not something I can explain, but I know one thing for sure. It wasn't human. The sun had long since set, leaving behind nothing but darkness. I carried a flashlight but barely needed it, as the faint glow of the moon guided me enough. The beach was deserted, just the way I liked it. I walked for what felt like hours, letting my thoughts wander with the rhythm of the tide. The waves lapped gently at the shore, creating a hypnotic sound that had always brought me a strange sense of calm. But that night, something felt off. The air wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. I kept glancing over my shoulder, a nagging sense of unease growing with each step. It wasn't until I reached the far end of the beach, where the sand met jagged rocks and the sea stretched out endlessly, that I noticed it. A figure, not far from where I stood, barely visible in the dim light. There was someone or something standing still, staring out at the ocean. I froze. My first thought was that it was another walker like myself, maybe someone else who had come to enjoy the solitude of the beach. But as I tried to make out more details, my stomach twisted in knots. The figure didn't move, it was just standing there, unmoving, as if frozen in time. The longer I stared, the more I felt the weight of its gaze. Though I couldn't make out any features, a chill ran down my spine. But I told myself to keep walking. There was no reason to panic. It could have been anyone. Right. But as I took a step forward, the figure shifted slightly, turning ever so slightly in my direction. It wasn't a human movement, there was something unnatural about it, jerky and deliberate, like a puppet controlled by strings. The urge to turn and flee was overwhelming, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart pounding. The figure continued to stare at me. There was no recognition, no sign of life, just that unrelenting, lifeless gaze. Then, without warning, the figure took a slow step forward. My body finally responded, and I turned and ran. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The sound of my footsteps faded into the endless crashing of waves. But the figure was still there, moving, growing closer with every step I took. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled to start the engine, my hands trembling. When I finally glanced up, the figure was gone, but I swear, I still feel its eyes watching me every time I close my eyes. I can see it. It's not something I can explain, but I know one thing for sure. It wasn't human. I could feel the presence of something intangible, like it was breathing down my neck. Sam grabbed my arm again, this time with desperate force. We sprinted, zigzagging through the garden until we finally burst through the main entrance, gasping for air. The night outside felt different, safer, as if we'd left the garden's grip behind. We didn't stop until we were back at my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away, the garden shrinking in the rearview mirror. But it wasn't until I got home and checked the back seat that I found it a small, wrinkled flower. One I had never seen before, sitting on the seat like an unholy offering. The voice echoed in my ears, an echo that would stay with me forever. Not so fast. The sun had just slipped below the horizon, leaving us in a twilight that made everything appear more vivid. It was there, in the middle of a patch of wild flowers, that I noticed something strange. The flowers were moving. I blinked, thinking it was just the wind, but the motion was rhythmic, like breathing. "Did you see that?" Sam asked, squinting at the patch. I nodded, but before I could say anything, there was a shuffling sound behind us, something small moving through the grass. We turned quickly, eyes searching the darkening garden, but it was empty. I laughed nervously, probably a raccoon or something, but Sam didn't look convinced. His eyes were fixed on the path we just walked down. A sudden chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as the cool of the evening. We decided to head back, but as we retraced our steps, I noticed that the garden was eerily quiet. The usual chirp of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl were gone. I stopped walking, listening hard. The silence was thick, suffocating. Then came the sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow steps coming from the direction we had just left. They weren't the light, scuttling steps of an animal, but the deliberate thud of boots against the stone path. My blood ran cold as I glanced at Sam. His face was pale, eyes wide. "Let's go," he whispered, grabbing my arm. We started to run, but the footsteps quickened, matching our pace. It was as if someone, or something, was shadowing us, step for step. The garden paths twisted and turned, dark shapes looming over us as we tried to find the exit. We reached a clearing and stopped to catch our breath. That's when I heard a low voice, raspy and wet, whispering from the shadows, "Not so fast." My heart raced as I spun around, searching for the source. There was no one there, but the whisper had come from just behind a massive oak tree. I could feel the presence of something intangible, like it was breathing down my neck. Sam grabbed my arm again, this time with desperate force. We sprinted, zigzagging through the garden until we finally burst through the main entrance, gasping for air. The night outside felt different, safer, as if we'd left the garden's grip behind. We didn't stop until we were back at my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away, the garden shrinking in the rearview mirror. But it wasn't until I got home and checked the back seat that I found it a small, wrinkled flower. One I had never seen before, sitting on the seat like an unholy offering. The voice echoed in my ears, an echo that would stay with me forever. "Not so fast." The last thing I expected was to find myself stuck on the side of a remote highway in the middle of nowhere at 11 p.m., with my car sputtering and coughing at its last breaths. I slammed my palms against the steering wheel, trying to stifle a curse. The darkness outside seemed to fold in on itself, thick and oppressive, with only the dull beam of my headlights cutting a path into it. I stepped out of the car, the chill in the air seeping through my clothes. The road stretched on for miles in either direction, bordered by dense, whispering trees. The only sign of civilization was a rusted sign, half hidden by creeping ivy, that read Riverton 10 miles. With a resigned sigh, I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help. No signal. Great. The road ahead seemed endless, so I decided to start walking, hoping to find a gas station, a house, anything. I made it about a mile before I heard it. A faint sound, like laughter, but not the kind that comes from joy. This was sharp, guttural, almost animalistic. I froze, my heart drumming in my chest. There was no one around. The woods were still, except for the subtle creak of branches overhead and the soft rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, and pushed on. Then the laughter came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy over the ground. I turned around, my eyes searching the dark, but there was nothing. The road was empty, the trees stood silent. I rubbed my arms to stave off the cold and continued walking. Faster now. The air seemed to change as I walked, becoming colder and sharper, like the knife edge of winter. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling of something being wrong. The laughter stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps following me, just at the edge of hearing. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw only shadows that seemed to shift and dart away. Then, without warning, something moved in the woods. A figure stepped out from between two trees, tall and thin, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Its face was pale, almost luminescent in the moonlight, with eyes so black they looked like holes drilled into its skull. The thing tilted its head, and then it spoke, lost. My legs locked up, and I stood frozen in place. I couldn't find my voice, couldn't tear my eyes away from that hollow, grinning face. It took a step forward, the uneven gait making the ground creak beneath it. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The figure took another step, and I finally snapped out of my paralysis, turning and bolting down the road as fast as I could. The sound of heavy footsteps pounding behind me, matched by that terrible, hollow laughter, drove me forward. The road blurred past, my vision cutting out between stumbles. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst, until my legs were cramping and I couldn't tell if the thud behind me was my own heartbeat or something chasing me. I didn't look back. I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to move. Then, suddenly, there was light dim and flickering. A street lamp, old and cracked, stood at the edge of the road. I scrambled toward it, the warm glow embracing me, a sanctuary from the cold. The laughter and footsteps stopped. Silence. I dared a glance behind me. Heart still racing, there was nothing but the night. The road was empty. The street lamp buzzed and flickered before dying, leaving me in a pitch-black void again. But then, a voice, "Need a ride." I whirled around, eyes wide. A truck sat at the end of the road, headlights on, engine purring. The driver's face was obscured in shadow, but the voice was familiar, as if I'd heard it before. A hand reached out, fingers long and thin, with skin that seemed to tight, to pale. My blood froze as I recognized it. The laughter returned, only it was my own voice, twisted and distorted, echoing from somewhere in the dark. It was supposed to be a simple day trip. My friends and I wanted to escape the city for a while. So, we decided to visit the old, abandoned amusement park just outside town. It had been closed for years, and rumors said it was haunted, but we didn't care. We were young, reckless, and looking for adventure. The park was a shell of its former self, with rusted rides and peeling paint. The Ferris wheel loomed over the grounds, its empty gondolas swaying slightly in the breeze. The air was heavy with the scent of old metal and something sour, almost like mildew. As we walked through the cracked entrance, a shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. We wandered from ride to ride, taking pictures and daring each other to step inside the old funhouse. Its glass was shattered, and the floor creaked beneath our weight as we stepped inside. The lights were long dead, but we each carried a flashlight, beams dancing across warped mirrors that distorted our reflections. "Did you hear that?" my friend, Marcus, whispered, and I strained my ears. It was faint but unmistakable laughter, high-pitched and childlike, like the giggle of a young girl. "Must be the wind," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But the laughter came again, clearer this time, coming from deeper inside the funhouse. I glanced at my friends. Sarah's face was pale, and Ben looked like he wanted to turn around and leave. "Let's just go," Ben muttered, eyes wide. But before anyone could move, the laughter grew louder, echoing through the halls of the funhouse, followed by a soft thumping sound, like small feet running across wood. Marcus took a shaky breath and pushed forward. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice faltered. We ventured further into the maze of warped mirrors and dark corners. I felt the back of my neck prickle as we reached the center of the funhouse. That's when I saw it, a small figure, standing in the shadows at the end of the hallway. The flashlight flickered, casting jagged, flickering light. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I saw. It was a girl, maybe 8 or 9, with tangled hair and a dress that looked decades old. Her back was turned to us, but as we watched, she tilted her head to one side, as if she knew we were there. "Hey," Sarah called, voice quivering. "Are you okay?" The girl slowly turned, and my blood froze. Her eyes were black, empty pits that seemed to draw in all light, and her mouth stretched into a smile that was far too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp. The air around us grew cold, and the flashlight went out. Marcus let out a strangled scream, and we all stumbled back, tripping over each other in a scramble to get out. The girl's laughter followed us, echoing and multiplying as if there were more of her. A chorus of voices overlapping and splitting in every direction. We ran, hearts pounding, pushing open the heavy doors of the funhouse. The laughter still rang in our ears as we sprinted across the park, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the main road, gasping for breath, tears streaming down our faces. When we looked back at the dark, silent amusement park, we saw the Ferris wheel. One of the gondolas was moving, slowly swinging back and forth, and then, from the top, a small face peeked out, eyes wide and empty, grinning down at us. We never went back. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of a child's laughter just beyond my window. I had never been a fan of driving long distances alone, but it was a rare chance to clear my head. My cousin's wedding was the next day, and I was determined to make it there. The route was scenic, winding through rolling hills and small towns that seemed frozen in time. As the sun began to set, I found myself in a stretch of road surrounded by dense woods with barely a sign of civilization. I pulled over when my phone buzzed, alerting me to a missed call. It was my cousin, reminding me of the directions and warning me that there would be no cell service in some areas. I laughed, thinking about how outdated that sounded, and tucked my phone away. That was the last sound I heard for a while. The road ahead curved into a darker part of the forest, the trees pressing in on either side like silent sentinels. As I drove, the headlights of my car bounced off the trunks, casting long, twisted shadows. I thought I saw movement up ahead, something darting just beyond the trees. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just a rabbit or a deer. But then I saw it again, a tall figure that looked like it had been molded from bark and leaves, standing just out of reach of the light. It moved, jerking with an unnatural rigidity, almost like it had been caught mid-step. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt as I stared into the dark. Nothing, just the forest and the dull thrum of my heartbeat. My hands were shaking as I started to drive again. The headlights barely cut through the twilight, and I swerved as I caught another glimpse of the figure, this time closer to the road. It was at the edge of my vision, a blur of movement. I didn't know if I should stop or keep going, but the road was empty behind me, and I couldn't risk turning around. Suddenly, my car's engine sputtered, and I watched in horror as the lights dimmed and then cut out altogether. The cabin of the car was plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the relentless thumping of my heart. I reached for my flashlight, feeling my palms turn cold as I fumbled to turn it on. A knock came from the driver's side window. My body froze, but my eyes went straight to the glass. A hand was pressed against it, long fingers reaching out with an unsettling rigidity. The skin looked rough, cracked, and speckled with dark patches. A face emerged, impossibly thin, with eyes that were wide and unblinking. It had a smile, but it was wrong. It was stretched too far, as though someone had pulled the corners of its mouth with hooks. I screamed, throwing the flashlight at the figure, but it was already retreating, melting back into the trees. The light illuminated the forest just long enough for me to catch sight of more figures. They emerged from the shadows like marionettes, limbs moving in angles they shouldn't, heads tilting back as if looking at something invisible. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal. There was none. The figures started to close in, moving with a quick, unnatural shuffle. I unlocked the car door, my fingers trembling, and I stepped out into the gravel. The night air was sharp, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of branches snapping as the figures came closer. Then, the headlights of another car appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me as the vehicle pulled up, and a man stepped out, his face lit with concern. "Are you all right?" he called, glancing around nervously. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the figures, the terror clawing at my throat. The man followed my gaze and looked back at me with wide, horrified eyes. "They're already here," he whispered, and then he was running, disappearing into the forest. The figures paused, their heads turning in unison to follow him, and I realized with a sickening jolt that they were all heading in the same direction toward the road where I had just been. My car roared to life as if in response, and I scrambled inside, slamming the door shut. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figures at the edge of the woods, watching. Their twisted faces held that same, stretched smile, and as they faded into the trees, I could almost hear them whispering a single word: "Run." The old amusement park had been abandoned for years, but I still remembered the stories. Tales of children who had gone missing, strange laughter echoing through the empty rides, and the ghost of the clown who would appear when the wind was just right. It was mostly local legend, but when my friends suggested we visit at midnight, I couldn't resist. There were 5 of us, me, Liam, Sophie, Rosa, and Mark. We parked by the rusted entrance, the iron gates hanging crooked and covered in ivy. The moon cast a pale glow over the place, illuminating the cracked pavement and twisted, metal rides that had once delighted hundreds of people. Now, they loomed like broken skeletons. "Are you sure this is safe?" Rosa asked, clutching her jacket around her. "It's just an old park," Mark said, his voice wavering with nervous excitement. What could happen? We wandered through the main entrance, the gravel crunching underfoot. The air was dense with the scent of old popcorn and the faint metallic tang of rust. My flashlight cut through the dark, landing on the broken Ferris wheel towering above us, its seat swaying in the wind. A low creak echoed as if it were groaning in its sleep. We decided to start with the haunted house. It was a small, decrepit building with peeling paint and shutters that flapped in the breeze. I pushed open the splintered door, and it let out a low, mournful moan. Inside, the darkness was suffocating, the air damp and cold. My flashlight barely cut through it, casting jagged beams across cracked mirrors and plastic skeletons. As we crept deeper into the maze of twisted halls, I noticed the whispers. They were soft at first, like the wind blowing through the building. Then they grew louder, more distinct, until it sounded like children giggling just around the corner. "Did you hear that?" Liam asked, voice tight with fear. "Probably just the wind," I replied, though my own voice sounded uncertain. But when we rounded the corner, we saw a clown in the corner of the room, sitting on a broken stool. It was more than just a mannequin, it was moving. The painted smile was chipped and cracked, revealing teeth that looked unnaturally sharp. Its eyes, hollow and dark, fixed on us. Liam gasped, but before any of us could scream, a loud crash came from behind. We spun around, my heart thundering in my chest. The hallway was empty, but something in the corner caught my eye, a pair of small, muddy shoes, too small for any adult. Then the giggling started again, louder this time, and we bolted. We stumbled out into the night, tripping over debris and each other. Behind us, the laughter followed, echoing through the park like a chorus. The clown was nowhere in sight, but we didn't dare look back. We sprinted to the entrance, but it was no longer there. The iron gates had vanished, replaced by the dark, brambled forest that surrounded the park. The laughter still rang out, coming from every direction now. My flashlight flickered, and in the cold glow, I saw them children, dressed in tattered clothes, eyes wide and empty, standing in the shadows. Mark screamed as one of them stepped forward, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it was the same pair of muddy shoes. The children were staring at us, their faces blank, but there was no mistaking their intent. They moved toward us, slow at first, then faster, their little feet pattering against the ground like raindrops. I grabbed Rose's hand and pulled her with me as we ran. We didn't stop until we burst out of the woods and into the clearing where the main road lay. Behind us, the laughter still called, fading slowly as we put distance between ourselves and the park. When we turned back, the amusement park was gone. The moonlight shone on an empty field. That was the last time I ever saw it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint laughter echoing in the distance and know they're still waiting. Eyes watching, feet pattering closer with every passing second. I never thought a simple trip to the county fair would lead to a night I couldn't forget. The fairgrounds were full of lights and music, the sounds of laughter mingling with the creak of carnival rides. It was a warm evening in late summer, the kind that makes you feel alive. My best friend and I had come to eat cotton candy, play games, and ride the Ferris wheel. We were there to have fun. Nothing more. We wandered through the fair, stopping at booths and laughing as I tried to win a stuffed animal from a claw machine. We moved from ride to ride, each one a mix of joy and adrenaline. As the night grew older, the crowds began to thin, the lights reflecting in puddles left by the day's rain. That's when we saw a sign for an attraction we hadn't noticed before, a large tent with wonders of the unseen written across the entrance in faded, curving letters. I nudged my friend and said, "Why not?" We haven't tried anything like this yet. He hesitated but agreed, and we stepped into the tent. The air was cool, the scent of damp canvas mixed with something metallic. Inside, a dimly lit space stretched before us, with rows of oddities on pedestals and glass cases. There were strange sculptures, eyes that seemed to watch you, and jars containing things that looked too grotesque to name. We wandered further, entranced by the bizarre display, until I noticed a small, unmarked glass case in the corner. Inside was a piece of paper, old and yellowed, with a single line scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. "Never turn your back on the silent one." A chill ran through me, and I glanced at my friend. He was staring at the case with wide eyes. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Before I could reply, a sound came from the back of the tent. It was a soft thud, followed by a scraping noise that seemed to draw closer. I turned quickly, heart hammering, and saw nothing but shadows. I felt the weight of those unseen eyes, as if the entire tent had shifted, as if it were holding its breath. A sudden scream pierced the silence, coming from somewhere in the dark. My friend's hand gripped mine so hard that it hurt, but I didn't dare look away from the shifting shadows. The scraping sound was louder now, followed by a soft, guttural whisper. "Go, now!" The voice came from behind us. I spun around, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a figure in tattered clothes, its face obscured by a hood. The eyes that peered out from under the fabric were black and deep, a void that seemed to pull at my mind. The whisper came again. "Leave this place. Leave now." I yanked my friend toward the exit, but the tent seemed to stretch, the entrance impossibly far away. We stumbled over discarded objects and felt the air grow colder. The sound of footsteps behind us quickened, a wet, dragging shuffle. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it getting closer, an unnatural presence that made my skin crawl. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, we burst through the entrance and into the moonlit fairgrounds. The lights seemed brighter, the noise of the music and laughter louder, as if we had just woken up from a nightmare. We ran to the nearest food stand, gasping for breath, eyes darting back to the entrance of the tent. It was empty. The sign for Wonders of the Unseen now looked torn and tattered, barely hanging on its posts. The tent had vanished, leaving only a dark patch of ground where it once stood. We didn't speak about what had happened that night. It was easier not to, but every now and then, when I hear a sound in the dark or feel something move just out of sight, I remember the whisper, the eyes, and the figure that stood in the shadows. Never turn your back on the silent one, and I know it's still out there. I had never been a fan of hiking, but I agreed to go with my friend on a spontaneous day trip to the forest. She promised the views would be worth it. We packed a few snacks, filled our water bottles, and set off before dawn, the crisp morning air stinging my cheeks as we climbed the narrow trail. The woods were dense, the trees towering over us and blocking out the sky. As we walked, I felt like we were moving through a different world, one where the usual sounds of birds and insects were swallowed by unnatural silence. My friend was ahead, her voice ringing out as she pointed out different plants and birds, but I wasn't listening. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midday, we stumbled upon a clearing that seemed perfect. A small, crystal-clear stream cut through the middle, flanked by wild flowers that looked too vibrant, too alive. The air felt heavier here, almost electric. I reached for my water bottle and drank, taking a moment to catch my breath. My friend sat on a mossy rock, pulling out a sandwich. That's when I heard a faint, rhythmic thumping, like distant drumming. I turned, searching for its source, but the forest was still and silent. My friend didn't seem to notice, focused on her sandwich, but the sound was growing louder, closer. It wasn't natural, not the sound of wildlife. It was deliberate, as though someone was tapping on something wooden, sending shivers down my spine. "Hey," I said, my voice tight. "Do you hear that?" My friend looked up, her brow furrowing. "What?" "The drumming," I said, but as I said it, the noise stopped. It was so sudden that it made the hairs on my arms stand up. We exchanged a quick glance, the kind that doesn't need words to say you're both terrified. But then, as if on cue, the sound resumed, louder and clearer than before. "It's coming from over there," I whispered, pointing toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing. We packed up quickly, the sense of urgency gnawing at my nerves. We began walking back the way we'd come, but the sound followed us, the thumping now joined by whispers. Low and unintelligible. It wasn't just following us, it was moving with us. I could feel my pulse racing, every step echoing like a drumbeat in my chest. The forest seemed to close in, the trees pressing tighter around us. I dared a look over my shoulder and froze. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure, a silhouette hidden among the trunks. It was tall, with long arms that moved unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. My friend must have seen the terror on my face, because she grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. "Run," she shouted. We ran, branches whipping our faces, feet stumbling over roots. The thumping grew louder, echoing in the clearing behind us. We didn't stop, not even when the path ahead split into two. We took the left, the wrong choice, but I didn't care. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath, white and misty in front of me. I heard a sound I'll never forget, a loud, guttural growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the forest. We burst out of the tree line, gasping for breath, and turned back to see the clearing behind us. There was nothing there, no figure, no noise. Only the stillness of the woods, as if nothing had happened. We didn't speak on the way home. Neither of us dared mention the sound, or the shape that had flickered in the corner of our vision. But when I checked my phone, I found a picture I didn't take, a dark figure with a face that wasn't human, standing at the edge of the clearing, and I knew we had never truly left the forest. I hadn't planned on taking the shortcut through the old park that evening. It was late, just past sunset, and I was already tired from the long day. But as I glanced at the road ahead, I realized the shortcut would get me home faster. The park was empty. As usual, no lights, no children's laughter, nothing to break the silence of the early evening. The path was narrow, bordered by overgrown bushes and the skeletal branches of old trees. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and kept my eyes on the path. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot. That's when I heard the first noise, a soft, rhythmic thumping. I stopped, heart clenching. It came from deeper in the park, a few yards off the main path. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, but then it grew louder, a thudding that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I hesitated. I could turn around, go back to the road, but the thumping was joined by another sound, faint but unmistakable, a child's giggle. It was high-pitched and cheerful, like the kind of laugh that would echo through a playground, but there were no children in the park. I knew that as surely as I knew my own name. I forced my feet forward, telling myself I was just imagining things. The thumping continued, and the giggle grew louder. I passed an old, rusted swing set, its chains creaking as if moved by an unseen hand. My breath quickened as I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. I turned, and for a moment, I saw a figure, small, dressed in white, standing at the edge of the woods. Its face was obscured by a curtain of hair. I didn't stop to think. I ran. I ran like I was being chased, the echoes of my footfalls mingling with the sounds behind me. The thumping had turned into pounding, a sound that seemed to follow me, no matter how fast I moved. I broke out of the park and onto the road, panting, my chest burning. The streetlights flickered on, casting their orange glow on the pavement. I dared a glance behind me, half expecting to see the figure from the woods. There was nothing, only the empty path winding through the park. When I reached my street, I didn't stop to check my mail or even look around. I dashed into my house, locked the door, and pushed a chair against it just in case. I stood there, trembling, telling myself it was just a bad dream, that the park was empty, that I was safe. The silence in the house was thick and absolute. But then I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic thumping, coming from outside my window. I looked out, heart slamming into my ribs, and there it was. The figure from the park, standing in the yard, staring at me. It tilted its head, and a smile spread across its face, a smile so wide, so impossibly twisted, that I felt sick. I backed away from the window, my fingers fumbling for my phone. But the thumping came again, louder this time, as if the ground itself were shaking. I glanced at my reflection in the glass, and for just a moment, I saw not my own terrified face, but that of a child, eyes wide and filled with dread. Then the window shattered. I don't remember running or what happened to that. I only know that the thumping, the giggling, and the figure were gone when I came to my senses. Sprawled in my living room, the cold night air biting at my skin, the police found nothing when they came. No broken glass, no evidence of anyone in the yard. Just an empty house and a story I would never tell. Not because I was afraid people wouldn't believe me, but because I knew, deep down, that the next time I heard that thumping, it would be much, much closer. I'd never been to my grandparents' house during the winter. They lived on an old farm at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by thick woods that stretched out like dark, gnarled fingers. It was late December, and the snow had started falling as we pulled into the long gravel driveway. My parents had decided we should visit for Christmas, and while the air was festive, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The house was beautiful in its own way, with its peeling paint and creaking porch. Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and the faded scent of old books. We gathered around the fireplace, my grandparents smiling warmly as they passed out hot chocolate and cookies. I was still trying to shake off the strange feeling from the ride when my grandfather pointed out the window. "Look at that," he said, a hint of worrying in his voice. I turned and saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was too far to make out details, but it looked like a person, hunched over, watching us. "Is someone out there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. My parents exchanged glances, and my grandmother's eyes narrowed. "It's probably just the wind," she said. But the wind didn't move like that. It didn't stand still and stare. After dinner, my parents decided to turn in early, and my grandparents suggested I stay up with them for a while. I hesitated but agreed. We sat by the fire, the flames casting long, flickering shadows across the room. The snow had picked up outside, and I watched it swirl past the window in thick white sheets. Suddenly, there came a knock at the door, a sharp, loud sound that made me jump. My grandfather stood, his face shadowed but his eyes intense. He walked over and opened the door, the cold air rushing in. There was no one there. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Go to bed, son," my grandfather said, but there was a tremor in his voice I'd never heard before. I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes silenced me. I nodded and went up to the room they had set up for me, shutting the door behind me. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the moonlight filtering through the window, listening to the sound of the wind howling outside. But then I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers on glass. It came from the window. I sat up, eyes fixed on the snow-covered pane, and then I saw it. A hand, pale and thin, pressed against the glass from the other side, followed by another, and then a face distorted, hollow-eyed, with a mouth that split open in an eerie, wide grin. It was looking right at me, and even through the glass, I could see the hollow, black void where its eyes should have been. My heart pounded, my vision blurred with panic. I backed away from the window, but the tapping didn't stop. It moved around the room, slow and deliberate, as if circling me, searching for an entrance. I scrambled for my phone, but it was dead, the battery drained from the cold. I grabbed the quilt off the bed and wrapped it around me, holding my breath as the tapping moved away. I waited, listening for the sound to stop, for the night to return to silence. But then I heard a voice, faint and echoing, "Come outside." It wasn't my grandfather. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was a voice that made my skin prickle and my blood run cold. I pressed my back to the wall, trying to disappear into the shadows as the tapping grew louder, this time coming from the door. The door creaked open, and I glimpsed a shape in the moonlight, a figure with elongated limbs, eyes black as coal, and that impossibly wide, sinister grin. I don't remember running or how I ended up outside, barefoot in the snow. But when I looked back, the figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind and the quiet crunch of snow underfoot. The next morning, I told my grandparents everything. They looked at each other, worrying in their eyes, and my grandfather said something I'll never forget. "That's not the first time it's been seen, but it won't come in unless you invite it." I never went back to that house again. But sometimes, when the snow falls and the night is still, I hear the faint tapping against my window, as if it's trying to get inside. The evening was beautiful. clear skies stretching over the vineyard like a dark velvet blanket. My friends and I had decided to spend the day at the family estate, my uncle's vineyard. It was a special occasion. The first harvest of the season was about to start, and we were all excited to celebrate. The sun had dipped behind the hills, painting the sky with deep hues of purple and gold as we wandered through the rows of grapevines. We'd finished dinner around a fire pit, swapping stories and toasting with glasses of homemade wine. Laughter echoed through the valley, blending with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. The scent of fermenting grapes lingered in the air, sweet and earthy. It was the kind of night you'd remember forever, peaceful, warm, safe. That's why I didn't understand why my skin prickled when we decided to take a walk along the edge of the vineyard. The night was so still, so perfect, but there was something in the air, an electric tension that didn't match the calm of the evening. The path led us to an old, abandoned shed at the far end of the property. It was the kind of structure that had long been forgotten, half hidden by ivy and thick underbrush. As kids, we had always dared each other to go near it, but we never did. Now, as adults, we found ourselves drawn to it, half-jokingly daring each other to go inside. I felt the pull of nostalgia and the thrill of the unknown. "Let's see what's inside," I said, the bravado in my voice masking the unease that had settled in my stomach. The others agreed, and we pushed open the wooden door. It creaked on its hinges, revealing a dark interior full of dust and cobwebs. The moonlight that filtered through the broken slats of the wall cast thin, shifting lines across the floor. I reached for my phone to light the way, its beam cutting through the darkness. "Is it just me? Or does it feel colder in here?" my friend Emily asked, shivering. "It's just the draft," I said, but my voice was hollow, even to my own ears. I took a step forward, my foot crunching on something sharp. I bent down and picked up a cracked wine bottle, its glass dull with age. It had an odd, musty smell, like something had spilled and been left to rot. Suddenly, a noise pierced the silence. It came from the back of the shed, a faint, scraping sound, like nails on wood. We all froze, eyes locked with each other. The sound came again, louder this time. It was unmistakably human, though twisted and uneven. "Hello," I called out, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. No response. The air grew colder still, and my breath came out in ragged puffs. Something moved in the dark, a shadow that didn't belong to any of us. I swung my flashlight in that direction, and for a moment, I saw it, a pale, thin figure with eyes that glowed a dull, unnatural green. It stood, unmoving, just beyond the beam's reach. The others screamed, and we stumbled backward toward the door. My heart thundered in my chest as I fumbled with the lock, finally shoving the door open. We ran out into the night, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we were back by the fire, gasping and shaking. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves and rattling the branches. But, as we caught our breath, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The pale figure was standing at the edge of the vineyard, just beyond the moon's light, watching us. The next day, we didn't go back to the shed. We didn't even mention it, but every time I passed that part of the property, I swore I could feel eyes on me, cold and hungry. I never told anyone what I saw, but I can still hear the scraping sound, like nails on wood, echoing in the back of my mind. I think it's still there, waiting. The sun had just set as I drove down the narrow, winding road that led to my grandmother's house. I had come to visit her for the weekend, a rare trip to reconnect after years of living in the city. The countryside was always eerie at twilight, with fields that stretched out like dark, restless oceans and rows of trees that seemed to watch me as I passed. My grandmother's house stood at the edge of a small, overgrown field, surrounded by clusters of wildflowers that seemed to move in the wind like they were whispering secrets. The air was still and heavy, tinged with the scent of damp earth. As I pulled up, the porch light flickered, casting shadows that rippled across the wooden planks. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot sounding louder than it should have in the silence. The house seemed to sigh, its old wood creaking in protest as if it had been holding its breath. I knocked on the front door, and at the moment, my grandmother appeared in the doorway, a smile softening the deep lines of her face. "Oh, you made it," she said. Her voice was weak but warm, and she pulled me into a tight embrace. The first night was simple enough. We sat in the kitchen, ate homemade pie, and listened to the quiet hum of the night outside. The only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. But, as the clock struck midnight, I heard something that made me pause mid-bite. A faint tapping noise came from the direction of the back door. I glanced at my grandmother, who looked suddenly tense, her eyes darting to the hallway that led to the back of the house. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, but her lips were pressed into a thin line. "It's probably just the wind," she said, though I could hear the tremor in her voice. I stood up and moved cautiously to the back door. The tapping was louder now, but there was no wind, no reason for it. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the latch and pulled the door open. Darkness met me, nothing but the field and the forest beyond. But then I saw a figure, cloaked in shadow, standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was too far away to make out any features, but it stood motionless, as if waiting. "Grandma, someone's out there," I called, turning back to look at her. Before she could answer, the figure moved forward, stepping out of the shadows. It was not human, not entirely. Its limbs were unnaturally long, joints bending in ways they shouldn't, and its eyes reflected the light from the porch in a sharp, unnatural gleam. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my hands trembling. "We need to call the police." My grandmother's eyes were wide, tears welling up as she reached for my arm. "It's too late," she whispered. "It's already here." The tapping resumed, but now it was all around the house. The walls groaned as though something heavy was pressing against them. A sudden crash sounded from the kitchen, and I spun around to see the figure, impossibly thin and contorted, standing on the other side of the glass window, its mouth open wide, a black void lined with teeth that seemed to stretch forever. I grabbed my grandmother's hand, dragging her toward the front door. We stumbled over furniture and ducked past shattered picture frames as the pounding grew louder, more insistent. But before we could make it out, the front door flew open, the hinges splintering as the wind howled through the room. There, framed by the moonlight, was the figure, now more solid, more real than I could have imagined. It stared at us, a twisted, unholy grin stretching across its face. And then I realized the truth. It wasn't here to take us, not tonight. It had come for something else. And behind us, I heard my grandmother's voice, distant and hollow, whispering, "It's here for me." A scream tore through the night as the figure lunged forward. But before it could reach us, it stopped, a ragged shudder passing through its body. Then it crumbled to the floor, melting into a puddle of shadow and wet earth. I blinked, disoriented, and looked at my grandmother. Her eyes were closed, a peaceful smile on her face. The tapping had stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was different, oppressive, and final. When I stepped outside, the figure was gone, but I noticed something. In the field behind the house, the ground was cracked, and the soil was dark, almost black, as though it had been scorched. And in the moonlight, I swore I could see shapes forming, figures reaching up from the earth, waiting for the next visitor. I drove back to the city that night, heart heavy and mind reeling. The countryside was quiet again, but I knew better now. Some things are never truly gone. Some things are just waiting. I was out for a late-night stroll through the neighborhood, hoping to clear my mind after a long day. The streets were empty, the streetlights casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the pavement. It was the kind of night that felt a little too still, the kind of night when you know something's off, but can't pinpoint what. I turned down a side street I hadn't walked down before. The houses here were older, with peeling paint and cracked shutters. The gardens were overgrown, wild ivy creeping up the walls like it was trying to pull the houses back into the ground. I felt a strange mix of curiosity and apprehension, but the quiet seemed inviting, so I pushed forward. I was about to turn back when I heard a soft, rhythmic thumping sound coming from inside one of the houses. My first thought was that it was just a creaky floorboard or an old appliance, but then I heard a voice. It was quiet at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder, repeating a single phrase over and over. "Help me, please." It's too late. My skin prickled. I glanced at the windows, but the curtains were drawn tight. I hesitated, torn between running and investigating. The voice was pleading, desperate. My instincts won out over my fear, and I found myself walking up to the front door. My knuckles white as I clenched them. The door creaked open when I pushed against it, as if inviting me inside. I stepped into the dark, the smell of mildew and something metallic filling my nose. The voice was louder now, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I tiptoed through the living room, every floorboard creaking beneath my feet. I didn't know why I was going toward the sound, but it was like I was being pulled by an unseen force. I reached the stairs and paused. The voice was coming from above, echoing down like a tortured plea. "Help me, it's too late." I swallowed hard and started up the steps, my heart pounding as the air grew colder with each step. The hallway at the top of the stairs was pitch black, but the voice led me to a room at the end. I pushed open the door and gasped. The room was empty except for a rocking chair, which was moving back and forth as if someone had just left it. The voice stopped suddenly, and a heavy silence fell over the room. I could feel the air pressing against me, thick and suffocating. Then I heard a sound like breathing, close and ragged. I spun around, but there was no one there. The chair stopped rocking. My blood ran cold as I felt a presence behind me, something sharp brushing against my neck. I turned quickly and saw a figure in the hallway, a shadow with eyes that glowed a deep, unnatural red. I stumbled back, hitting the wall with a thud. The shadow moved closer, its limbs stretching impossibly long, and then I realized what it was. It was me, or at least a version of me, eyes hollow and face twisted in a grotesque smile. "It's too late," it whispered, reaching out with fingers that were more like claws. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the chair, which had started rocking again, as if waiting for me to take a seat. When I woke up, I was outside the house, lying in the grass with the first rays of dawn creeping over the horizon. I stumbled to my feet and ran home, my mind reeling. I never spoke about what happened that night, but I'll never forget the look in those eyes, and every night since then, I hear that voice, echoing through the quiet streets. "Help me, please. It's too late." I didn't expect the quiet to be so loud. The wind had stopped, and the moonlight cast long, distorted shadows across the deserted parking lot of the old amusement park. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, still and broken, like a giant skeleton. It had been years since anyone had come here, but I'd wanted to see it one last time. The place had been the highlight of my childhood, a backdrop for days spent laughing and riding the roller coasters until we were dizzy. I hadn't realized just how eerie it would feel to stand there alone, to be surrounded by the crumbling reminders of happier days. My shoes crunched over the gravel as I made my way toward the carousel. It was wrapped in rust and shadow. The painted horses froze in mid-gallop, their eyes cracked and hollow. I thought I heard something. A whisper, barely louder than the wind that was now just a memory. My heart picked up speed, but I told myself it was the sound of my own nerves. I wasn't alone, though. I knew it, deep down in my gut. I wasn't the only one there. I turned to leave, the uneasy sensation pressing at the back of my neck. But then I heard a laughter that rang out, bright and childlike, from the direction of the fun house. My breath caught in my throat. No one had been there when I arrived. I would have seen them. The fun house had been sealed shut, its doors warped and peeling like cold skin. The laughter came again, louder this time, and then a second sound joined it, a deep, grating laugh that didn't belong to any child. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself forward, past the ticket booths and past the warped remnants of the bumper cars. Each step was a battle, and when I reached the entrance to the fun house, I hesitated. The glass panels were cracked and warped, reflecting my pale, wide-eyed face back at me. The laughter stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I knew I should run. I knew I should get out of there and never come back. But I was frozen, and then the door creaked open on its own, as if inviting me in. I stepped inside, and the air was damp and heavy, filled with the scent of mold and something sharp I couldn't place. The sound of my breath echoed in the empty halls, and the lights overhead flickered to life, casting jagged shadows that danced like living things. I took a shaky step forward, and then another. My fingers brushed against the peeling wallpaper, and I shuddered. There were mirrors everywhere, warped and cracked. They made me look like I was bending and breaking, and in some, I saw reflections of people I knew I hadn't brought with me. A girl with dark hair and wide, staring eyes. A man with hollow cheeks and a grin too wide to be human. I spun around, searching for the exit, but I couldn't remember how I'd gotten in. My pulse quickened as I heard the sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, behind me. The sound echoed in the mirrored hallways, and I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving just out of reach. I whipped around, heart slamming against my ribcage, but there was nothing. Just my reflection, looking back with a smile that wasn't mine. The laughter came again, closed this time, and I screamed. I ran, blindly, the world around me a whirl of broken glass and cracked laughter. I stumbled and fell, scraping my palms against the cold tile, and when I looked up, the hallway was no longer empty. Figures emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, with eyes that glistened like wet stones and smiles that stretched impossibly wide. The last thing I saw before I turned and bolted was my own reflection in the cracked mirror. It wasn't a mirror anymore. It was a face, pale and twisted, reaching out for me with fingers that passed through the glass and grabbed my arm. I never stopped running. I burst out of the fun house and into the cold, empty night, gasping for air. The laughter still echoed behind me, but when I dared to look back, the fun house was gone. Just an empty patch of ground, a dark hole in the earth. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know this. When I left that night, I wasn't alone, and whatever it was, it followed me home. I was out on a solo hike when it happened. It wasn't planned, just a spontaneous decision to leave my apartment and get lost in nature for a day. The forest was dense and ancient, with trees so tall they blocked out the sun and leaves that whispered secrets to one another in the wind. I'd wandered for hours, passing old trails marked only by fading footprints and gnarly roots that reached out like fingers. When I found the clearing, it was the sort of place you only see in dreams: bright green grass, wildflowers peppered like spilled paint, and an eerie silence that made everything feel suspended in time. I paused to catch my breath and took in the moment. But then I noticed it, a cabin at the edge of the clearing. It was small, with a roof that sagged under the weight of years and a porch that had rotted through in places, making it look like it could collapse with a gust of wind. The place wasn't on any map. I took a step toward it, heart pounding in my chest. Why would a cabin be out here, far from the nearest trail? Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the warped door open. Inside, the air was thick and musky. Dust curled in lazy swirls in the slanted beams of sunlight. The room was empty, except for an old rocking chair that moved on its own, creaking in time with the groan of the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind, but I could feel something in the room, something intangible and heavy. I stepped closer to the chair, and that's when I heard a faint voice, like a whisper threading through the walls. It was too low to make out, but I could feel it brushing against my ears. Then came the sound of someone shifting in the corner of the room, a scraping noise as if someone was pulling themselves forward. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just silence, deep and smothering. I was about to leave when I noticed a dusty journal sitting on a rickety table. I reached for it, the pages brittle under my fingers. I flipped through, reading bits of handwriting that had faded with time. It told the story of a family who had once lived in the cabin, a family that had gone missing without a trace. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. They're here. They watch. They wait. A loud bang shattered the silence, and I jolted, eyes darting around the cabin. The rocking chair had stopped moving. In its place was a set of footprints, freshly imprinted in the dust, leading toward the window. I rushed forward, but there was no one outside, just the forest stretching out, deep and dark, with shadows that seemed to twist and coil. I turned to leave, but a shadow flickered in the corner of my vision. I blinked, and suddenly the room was full of people. Their faces were pale, eyes wide and unblinking, mouths open in silent screams. They were trapped between this world and the next, staring at me as if I were the one who had summoned them. I stumbled back, heart pounding, when a hand brushed mine, icy cold and shaking. I yelped and turned to see the pale, twisted face of a child. "Help us," the voice whispered, echoing from every corner of the room. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder, pressing down on me like a vice. I bolted, ignoring the splintered floorboards underfoot as I ran. The forest outside, once so welcoming, now felt like a labyrinth that would never let me escape. But I didn't stop until I was back on the main trail, gasping for air and looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them following. They weren't there. The woods were still, as if nothing had happened. I never told anyone what I saw that day, and I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear that same whisper, telling me they're still waiting. It was supposed to be a quick detour, a drive through the hills to cut down on the time it would take to reach my parents' house. The winding road was flanked by tall oaks, their branches tangled like the gnarled fingers of an ancient guardian. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep reds and purples, and the distant rumble of thunder promised rain. I was alone, and as the road twisted upward into a shadowed pass, I felt an unsettling chill pass through the car. The road was deserted, not even a stray cyclist or a farmer's pickup, just me and the thickening darkness. The first sign that something was wrong came when I noticed an old, rusted sign by the roadside, half hidden by overgrown vines. It said, "Welcome to Hollow's End." I frowned. I had never heard of this place. The path seemed to narrow as I continued, the forest pressing in like a dark curtain. The engine sputtered, but I convinced myself it was just the old car. I turned the key, and after a few stutters, the car roared back to life. Then I saw them. A group of children playing by the side of the road, barefoot, their clothes tattered, their laughter hollow and piercing. They moved like marionettes, limbs jerking in rhythm to a music only they could hear. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but I could see the glint of their eyes. Wet and reflective, I should have kept driving, should have floored the pedal and never looked back. But curiosity, that same force that got me into this mess, kept me glued to the wheel. I slowed the car, rolling down the window just enough to hear, "Come play with us," one whispered, its voice high and trembling, almost childlike, but not quite. I swallowed, heart pounding in my chest. "I'm not here to play," I muttered, my voice barely audible. The children stopped moving as one, and the silence stretched between us like a taut rope, their heads tilted in unison, as if inspecting a rare specimen. Then they spoke together, their voices blending into a chorus that sent ice coursing through my veins. "Everyone plays with us." A sudden, bone-shaking wind howled through the pass, slamming into the car and rattling the windows. I jerked backward, pressing my foot on the gas, but the car refused to respond. The children's laughter twisted into something guttural and inhuman. They scattered, not into the woods, but toward the road, forming a line that blocked my path. Their limbs bent in unnatural angles as they moved, their eyes wide and black as the night. "Leave," I screamed, panic clawing at my chest. The car shuddered, and with a burst of metallic groaning, it roared back to life, surging forward. The road blurred past as I drove, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror, expecting to see them in pursuit, but they were gone. Relief was short-lived. The rain began, first as a trickle, then a downpour so heavy I could barely see. I wiped the water from my eyes and looked up, and there it was, Hollow's End, a village that shouldn't have existed. It was a cluster of old, run-down houses with windows like hollow eyes, the streets slick and black under the storm. Smoke coiled from a chimney, though no lights flickered, no movement. It was as if the town were holding its breath. I was pulling into a driveway before I could stop myself. The front porch creaked under the weight of my steps as I knocked on the door. A woman opened it, her hair disheveled, her eyes sunken. "They've come for you," she said, stepping aside as if she'd been expecting me. The rain was gone now, and so was the wind, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. I stumbled inside, but before I could speak, I saw them, hundreds of children, standing in the yard beyond the window. Their hollow eyes met mine, and they whispered as one, "Everyone plays with us." The woman looked at me and smiled, a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Welcome to Hollow's End. You'll never leave." It was supposed to be just a day trip, a last-minute plan to take my dog, Duke, for a hike in the hills behind my house. I'd been so caught up with work lately, barely having time to breathe, that this spontaneous adventure felt like the reset I needed. The air was crisp, and the early autumn leaves crunched underfoot as we made our way deeper into the forest. Duke was a big, happy mutt, bounding ahead as we walked. The trail narrowed, the trees arching over us and weaving together like they were trying to hold secrets. I laughed when Duke paused, his ears twitching. He was always so alert, but today, something seemed different. He glanced back at me, eyes wide and dark. "Come on, buddy. It's just the wind," I muttered, shaking off the unease. But when I turned back, I realized the air had grown still, suffocating even. The usual chirping of birds had stopped. The silence was oppressive, as if the whole world had paused just for us. A sharp snap, like a branch breaking, came from deeper in the woods. I stiffened, my skin crawling. Duke's hackles were raised, and he let out a low growl. I took a deep breath and whispered, "It's just a deer. Duke, relax." But my voice sounded too loud in the silence. We pushed forward, the trail barely visible now as the trees closed in. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the tension. I pulled it out, grateful for the distraction. It was a text from my friend, Alex, asking how the hike was going. I was typing my response when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from behind me. Duke's growl deepened, a low rumble in his chest. I spun around, searching the gloom between the trees. There was nothing but shadows, nothing but that damn silence. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, chittering sound, like 1,000 tiny feet scrambling against bark. "Duke, let's go," I whispered, suddenly feeling the weight of the forest pressing down on me. I turned, starting back the way we came, but as I did, I caught sight of a figure standing still between the trees. Its limbs were too long, stretched in an unnatural way, and it watched us with eyes that reflected the sliver of light from above. Duke barked sharply and took off, charging down the trail as fast as his legs would carry him. I had no choice but to follow, my breath coming in ragged gasps as we ran. The path twisted and turned, the underbrush snagging at my clothes as I pushed through. I could feel it behind us, a whisper of movement and the chill of something unseen. My phone chimed again, and I grabbed it, nearly stumbling as I tried to see the screen. Alex had sent a second message. "Everything okay? You've been gone a while." Before I could respond, a deafening thud erupted from behind me, followed by a guttural screech that made my blood freeze. The air was thick with the smell of earth and something metallic. I dared a glance over my shoulder, and for just a moment, I saw it. The figure from before, only closer now. Its mouth twisted into a grin full of jagged teeth and hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the light. I felt an icy hand grip my spine as I stumbled forward. The trail ahead looked familiar, a sign of civilization just up the way, a park bench and the edge of a clearing. I pushed myself faster, tripping over roots and rocks as the sound of footsteps behind me grew louder. Just as I reached the clearing, I heard the voice call out, raspy and unnatural, from the shadows, "You can't leave." I didn't stop. I sprinted the last few feet, grabbing the bench and clambering up as I gasped for air. Duke, panting and wide-eyed, scrambled up beside me. When I looked back into the woods, there was nothing but the dark, swaying branches. The trail was silent again, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way. The voice echoed in my mind, that phrase haunting me, "You can't leave." It was the last thing I heard before I turned and ran the rest of the way home, knowing that the forest behind me was watching, waiting, and that whatever had followed us out hadn't left. It started as an innocent idea. My friends and I were looking for something to do one evening, and when Mark suggested we explore the abandoned amusement park just outside of town, it seemed like the perfect adventure. We were young, reckless, and eager for a thrill, unaware that the park had a reputation. The sun was just beginning to set as we approached the rusted gates, which hung crooked and creaked in the wind. The faded, peeling sign read "Wonderland of Wonders" in letters that had almost been swallowed by time. We stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of metal and the faint, sharp tang of rust. The place was silent except for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant screech of a crow. We walked past the ticket booth, its glass pane shattered and dark, and made our way to the old Ferris wheel. It loomed above us, a skeletal giant. The paint was chipped and flaking, and the seats were bent and warped, some hanging at odd angles. We dared each other to climb up into the rusted cars and take photos. I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture as Sam posed dramatically, making a face. That's when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a stick tapping on metal. At first, I thought it was just a rodent, but then it came again, closer this time. I glanced at Mark, who was staring at the carousel. The horses were frozen mid-gallop, their eyes wide and hollow, as if they had seen something that terrified them. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely above a breath. We all exchanged uneasy glances, the jovial air now replaced with tension. We started walking toward the carousel when the tapping sound came again, this time from behind us. I turned quickly, heart racing, but the place was empty. Just the broken down rides, the scattered debris, and the wind that seemed to have picked up speed. "Maybe we should leave," I suggested, glancing nervously at the way we had come. "No, let's check out the fun house," Sam said, his voice cracking. He tried to sound brave, but it came out hollow. We hesitated, but curiosity won out, and we made our way toward the warped fun house at the center of the park. The entrance was a gaping mouth, the teeth jagged and chipped. The darkness inside seemed to beckon us. We stepped inside, and the air grew colder, the smell of damp and decay stronger. The floor creaked as we moved through, and suddenly the sound started up again, tapping, like fingernails on glass. I shivered, but before I could say anything, Sam screamed. We rushed to him, finding him backed up against a mirror, staring at his reflection. But it wasn't just his reflection, it was a face, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at him with a grin that stretched impossibly wide. It moved, just slightly, tilting its head like it was studying him. He stumbled away, pushing past us, and we bolted out of the funhouse, gasping for breath. Outside, the wind had stopped, and the silence was deafening. We didn't speak, just ran back to the entrance, but as I glanced behind me, I saw hundreds of reflections in the shattered mirrors of the funhouse, all faces that were watching us, grinning, unmoving. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the main road, gasping and shaking, looking back to see the amusement park shrouded in darkness. The only light was the faint glow of the moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the broken rides. To this day, we never speak of what happened there. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a soft tapping sound, like nails on glass, and I know that somewhere, in the dark, a reflection is waiting for me to look. I never thought a simple apartment would be the place where I'd experience something so terrifying. It started out like any other routine, working long hours, barely having enough time to eat, and coming back to my cramped, inexpensive apartment late at night. The building I lived in wasn't great, but it was cheap. And it was close to my job. It was an old place, with narrow hallways and flickering lights that made me feel like I was in a horror movie. Most of the tenants were quiet, reclusive types, people who just wanted to live in peace without much hassle. One evening, I returned from work and noticed something off. The door to my apartment was slightly ajar, not wide open, just a crack, as if someone had left in a hurry or forgotten to fully close it. I don't know why I didn't think twice about it. Maybe I was just exhausted. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt that unease creeping in. The air felt thick, heavier than usual, like it wasn't circulating properly. I closed the door behind me and tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Everything seemed in its place, no signs of a break-in, no obvious disturbances. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until I went to the bathroom that I found it. The mirror. It wasn't cracked, but it was smeared. I could see fingerprints along the edges, almost like someone had pressed their hands against it and slowly moved them around, leaving greasy streaks. I didn't know how I didn't notice it earlier. I had been in the bathroom just that morning. I wiped the mirror clean, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept hearing faint noises, scraping sounds, like nails dragging against the floor. They weren't constant, but every now and then, I'd hear them from somewhere outside my bedroom door. I told myself it was just the building settling, an old structure making strange noises, but then I heard something else. A whisper, just outside my door. It was a voice, soft and almost melodic, but it made my blood run cold. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't my imagination. It was clear, too real to ignore. The whispering continued, a low hum that seemed to get closer with every passing minute. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, wondering if someone had broken in. But if they had, why didn't they make a sound when they came in? I crept to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I stood still for a moment, waiting for any sound. The whispering stopped, and I thought I'd imagined it. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stepped out into the hallway and looked around. Nothing. It was just the usual dim lighting and the closed doors of other apartments. But the air felt wrong, colder than usual. As I walked back to my apartment, I glanced toward the elevator. It was an old, creaky thing, but it was never in use at night. Except tonight. It was moving, slowly, the lights flickering as it descended. I froze. The elevator doors opened, and no one was inside. I didn't waste another second. I rushed back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing. I couldn't explain it. I felt like I was losing control of everything, my thoughts, my senses. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me for days. Something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. The next morning, I went to the landlord's office to ask about the strange events. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the building for years. She looked at me with a concerned expression when I mentioned hearing noises and seeing the elevator move on its own. "Oh, that happens sometimes," she said, her voice low and almost too calm. "The building has a history." I was about to ask her what she meant when she continued, "People hear things in this place, footsteps, whispers, and sometimes the elevator moves by itself. It's just the old pipes. You know, the building settles." She smiled politely, but there was something off about her tone. "Don't worry, though, it's harmless." I didn't feel reassured. That night, the same strange things happened again. The whispering, the scratching, the elevator. But this time, something changed. The whispering wasn't just a voice, it was my voice. It was me, but not me. A distorted, mocking version of my own voice, saying things I hadn't even thought. Things like, "You're still here, and it's only just begun." Panicked, I rushed to the bathroom to see if I was imagining things. But then I saw the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't my reflection. There was a woman standing in my place, her face twisted in an expression I couldn't quite recognize. Her eyes were hollow, dark, and she was smiling. I stumbled back, almost falling over, and as I turned to run, I heard her voice, clear as day, from behind me. "You're not leaving." The first time I saw the old man, I thought he was just a local, wandering through the market like everyone else. It was late afternoon, the sun a lazy disk in the sky, painting the city in hues of gold and shadow. I was at the open-air market, the kind with vendors yelling about their wares, hawking everything from fresh fruit to handmade jewelry. I always loved coming here. It was a small escape from the monotony of my life. He was standing by the flower stall, head bent, as if examining the petals. He was tall and thin, with a face creased into a labyrinth of wrinkles, eyes clouded and pale. When I caught him staring, I looked away quickly, my skin crawling. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just an old man, lonely and curious. I didn't see him again until later, that evening when I was walking home, weaving through the narrow, cobbled streets. The sky had darkened, and the street lamps cast long, flickering pools of light across the pavement. As I passed an abandoned building, I heard the sound of shuffling feet behind me. I turned, and there he was, his pale eyes fixed on me, hands shaking at his sides. "Are you following me?" I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. He stopped, tilted his head, and said something so low I couldn't make out the words, but the way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine, as if he knew something I didn't. I quickened my pace, heart thundering in my chest. The sound of his footsteps echoed after me until I reached the safety of the busy street where people still lingered, chatting and laughing. I dared a glance over my shoulder, but he had vanished. The next day, I woke up to a strange feeling, the air in my room heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of feeling that makes you check the locks on your doors, make sure every window is secure. I told myself it was just paranoia, but when I pulled open the curtains, my heart almost stopped. There, in the alleyway just across from my apartment, the old man stood. He stared, unmoving, his eyes wide and hollow. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he raised a hand and pointed directly at me. A rush of icy dread shot through me. I slammed the window shut, the thud shaking the walls. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I stayed home, peeking through the blinds, waiting for him to reappear. Hours passed, the light shifting from morning to afternoon, but he didn't come back. Just as I let out a shaky breath, there was a knock at the door. I hesitated, frozen, and then a voice called out, "Hello. Miss. Are you okay? It's the building manager. We've had reports of strange activity." I opened the door a crack, heart hammering. He stood there in a neat, gray uniform, eyes kind but curious. I nodded, mutely, and he continued, "We've been getting complaints about someone lurking in the alley. Any idea who it might be?" I tried to speak, but couldn't. Finally, I managed to say, "An old man. He's been watching me." The manager raised an eyebrow. "There's no one out there now, but we've had similar reports for weeks. People say he appears and disappears like a shadow, never coming any closer." My blood ran cold. "Do you know who he is?" The manager shook his head. "He's been around for years. People say he's a ghost, or something worse. But he only appears to those who need to see him. Stay inside tonight, miss." I thanked him, my voice trembling, and shut the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards, had me on edge. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard a faint tapping at the window. Light as a feather, I couldn't help myself. I pulled the curtains aside, and there he was, standing in the dark, one hand pressed to the glass as if trying to push through. Before I could scream, he whispered in a voice barely audible, "You're not safe." The glass fogged up with his breath, and a shape appeared, a face. My own face, but older, withered and cracked, eyes hollow and dark. I stumbled back, gasping. He vanished into the night, leaving only the chill and the echo of those words. It's been years now, and I've never seen him again. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right or when the street lamps flicker in the dark, I swear I feel that cold, hollow stare, waiting, watching, and I know he's still out there, looking for the next one to hear his warning. It was a quiet evening when we decided to drive out to the old orchard on the edge of town. I had heard stories about it being haunted, but they were just that, stories. I was with a group of friends, all of us looking for a break from the same old routine. The moon was full, casting a pale glow that made the rows of gnarled apple trees look like twisted, skeletal sentinels. As we parked the car and stepped out, the silence swallowed us whole. No rustle of leaves, no distant hum of traffic, just the cold wind cutting through the branches and the sound of our feet crunching over the gravel path. The air was heavy, as if it were holding its breath. We wandered through the orchard, laughing and daring each other to go farther. It was just a bit of fun, a way to make memories. But then we reached the center of the orchard, where the trees were so dense they blocked out most of the moonlight. The ground here was soft and spongy, and something felt off. One of my friends, Mark, bent down to pick up a rock, brushing his hand against the damp earth. "Hey, look at this," he said, holding up the rock. It was cracked, but that wasn't what made me freeze. It was the pale, sinewy root that curled around the rock, creeping like a finger. "Come on, that's just a root," Sarah said, but her voice trembled. The breeze picked up, carrying with it a low, groaning sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the orchard. We all looked at each other, uneasy. Suddenly, without warning, the ground beneath our feet shuddered. It was a soft tremor at first, but then it grew, vibrating so violently that I almost fell. In the panic, we shouted for each other to move, but no one wanted to break free of the circle we had formed. That's when I saw it. From between the twisted roots and the base of the trees, something emerged. It was thin, impossibly long, with limbs that bent in the wrong directions. Its skin was ashy gray, and its eyes were black wells that seemed to pull at my sanity. It reached out, claw-like hands stretched to the sky. "Run!" I yelled, and the group scattered, leaving me behind as I stumbled over the rough ground. The trees around us creaked and groaned as if alive, the roots shifting and moving like they were trying to trip us up, to pull us back into the dirt. I was the last to make it to the edge of the orchard, just as I reached the line of trees where the moonlight shone through. I glanced back and saw it standing there, watching me. The thing didn't follow, but its black eyes locked onto mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. It whispered something. The voice was the sound of scraping rock, a word I couldn't make out, but I knew it was speaking my name. I ran without stopping until I hit the road and found my friends, panting and wide-eyed. We didn't look back as we drove away, the engine roaring against the silence behind us. The next day, I returned to the orchard, wanting to prove to myself that it had been an illusion. But when I got there, it was just as it always had been, silent, desolate, a place that seemed forgotten. I noticed, however, that in the soil, where the rock had been picked up the night before, there was a shallow impression of a handprint, long, slender fingers etched in the dirt as if someone had pressed against the earth, trying to reach out. I left without saying a word to anyone. That night, as I lay in bed, the same whisper came back to me, this time louder, clearer. It called my name again, from somewhere far in the distance, and I knew it would never stop. We started our hike early, the sun just beginning to climb above the horizon, painting everything in soft hues of pink and gold. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with the kind of crisp air that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. The hike itself wasn't too difficult, and we made good time. The cliffs loomed ahead, their jagged edges sharp against the sky. By noon, we reached the highest point. We stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. Below, the ocean stretched out endlessly, its deep blue surface dotted with white caps. The rocks beneath our feet were slippery, but we were careful. There was no real danger, just awe at how wild and beautiful the world could be. We ate lunch on the cliffs, chatting about everything and nothing, when the first odd thing happened. At the far end of the cliff, just out of sight from where we were sitting, there was a figure. It wasn't someone from our group. This person was standing motionless, facing the ocean, a dark silhouette against the light. I squinted, trying to make out details, but they were too far away. I mentioned it to the others, but they just laughed it off. Probably someone else out here, Mark said. Lots of people hike this spot, but it felt strange. The figure didn't move, not even to adjust their posture, just standing still, unmoving. I turned away, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It wasn't until we finished eating and packed up to leave that the figure became more troubling. We hadn't seen them leave, and the spot they were standing in was still empty. But the odd thing was, we now found fresh footprints in the dirt, footprints that led directly to the cliff's edge. I could tell they were recent, still deep and dark in the dirt, like someone had been standing right there only moments before. We followed the trail, but it led nowhere. The cliffs dropped sharply into the ocean below, with nothing but jagged rocks and a vast emptiness stretching out. There was no way the person could have just walked off the edge. It didn't make sense. I didn't say anything at the time, but the unease was growing in me. There was something wrong here. The longer I looked at the prints, the more unsettled I became. They didn't seem like the footprints of someone who had been hiking. They were too deliberate, too precise, like they had been placed there for a reason. I tried to push it out of my mind, but as we began heading back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. My skin prickled with an invisible tension. We continued, laughing and talking, but I kept looking over my shoulder. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, we began to make our way back toward the parking area. That's when I saw it again, the same figure. This time, they were not far from us, standing in the shadow of a large rock. Their back was to us, but I could see something clearly. They were holding something in their hands, something I couldn't identify, but it was too big and too unnatural to ignore. I stopped walking, and my friends turned to look at me. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. "There's someone over there," I said, pointing. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. The space was empty. "Stop messing with us," Mark said, rolling his eyes. "There's no one there," but I was sure. I'd seen it clearly. My heart began to race. I wanted to leave, to get back to the car and drive far away from this place, but something made me stop. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. We reached the parking area just as the sun was setting. It was a small, gravel lot with a single path leading to the main road. As we neared the cars, I heard a sound, a low, grating noise, like something scraping against stone. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing behind us except the dense trees and the empty, silent cliff. But then, I heard something else, a voice. It was faint, carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. The voice was saying my name. I froze. It wasn't one of my friends. It was a voice I didn't recognize, soft but clear, as if it had been waiting for me to hear it. Don't leave. I snapped around to face my friends, but they were already piling into the cars, unaware of the chill that had run down my spine. I didn't tell them what I'd heard. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just wanted to get out of there. We left the cliffs, the strange voice still echoing in my mind. The car ride back was quiet, everyone too exhausted to talk. But when I got home later, that night, I noticed something on my phone, a new notification, a picture. It was a photo of me, taken from behind, standing on the edge of the cliffs. But I was alone in the photo. The figure was nowhere to be seen. And then, I noticed something chilling in the background. There was someone else in the shadows, just out of view, watching me from a distance.